You don't have to figure everything out right now. You don't have to fix yourself tonight. Most of the pressure you carry isn't as urgent as it feels, and most of what you think about yourself isn't as final as it seems. This is a slow video of quiet, reassuring truths, something you can listen to without effort. If you enjoy long, calming videos like this, like and subscribe to our channel Restwise. These take a lot of time to make, and your support helps keep the channel going. Let's begin. Nothing about today needs to be solved tonight. It is strange how the mind waits until the room gets quiet to bring up everything it could have mentioned 12 hours ago. All day, you might have been functioning, answering messages, handling things, smiling when needed, moving from one task to the next like your body knew exactly what to do. And then the second your head touches the pillow, your brain suddenly decides now is the perfect time to hold a board meeting about your entire life. The awkward thing you said, the bill you need to pay, the future you have not figured out, the relationship you keep trying to decode, the version of yourself you think you should be by now, it all shows up at once, as if nighttime is some sacred deadline for solving what daylight could not. But here is the part nobody says clearly enough. Your brain is lying to you when it tells you that staying awake equals progress. That feeling of urgency you get at night is not wisdom. It is not clarity. It is not some deep intuitive truth finally surfacing. A lot of the time it is just an overtired nervous system looking for control. And when the body is exhausted, the mind becomes dramatic. Everything feels bigger at midnight, more final, more personal, more dangerous. Problems that might feel manageable at 2 in the afternoon can feel life-altering at 1:30 in the morning. Not because they changed, but because you did. Your body chemistry changed. Your emotional resilience dropped. Your perspective narrowed. There is actually a reason for this. When you are tired, the brain becomes worse at emotional regulation and better at catastrophizing, which is a very fancy way of saying your mind starts acting like a terrible life coach. It zooms in on threat, it repeats unfinished things, it scans for what is unresolved because the brain hates open loops. It wants completion, it wants certainty, it wants a clean ending before sleep. But life does not work like that. Some things take one conversation, some take 6 months, some truths only make sense after enough time has passed, and some things are not asking to be solved at all. They are asking to be felt, survived, or simply left alone until morning. That is the part most people fight. You are not usually losing sleep because your life is impossible. You are losing sleep because you are trying to force resolution during the one part of the day when your mind is least qualified to provide it. And if you have done this for a while, it can feel almost responsible, like if you let go tonight, something important will slip through your fingers. Like resting would mean you do not care enough. Like if you stop mentally circling the issue, you are being lazy or avoidant or weak. But there is a massive difference between avoiding a problem and postponing it until you can actually think clearly. That is not denial. That is wisdom. That is emotional maturity, because not everything urgent is important, and not everything important needs to be handled right now. Think about how many things in your life have eventually worked themselves into shape without you solving them in one heroic burst of midnight overthinking. Conversations you dreaded that ended up being okay, decisions that felt impossible until one day the answer became obvious, emotions that felt endless but quietly passed when you stopped interrogating them. So much of healing and clarity is not produced by force, it is produced by space, by sleep, by stepping away long enough for your mind to stop gripping the problem so tightly. And this matters because the brain does something powerful when you sleep. It does not just shut off. It reorganizes, it sorts memory, it lowers emotional intensity. It literally helps your mind process what felt too tangled to understand when you were awake, which means the most productive thing you might do for your life tonight is not to think harder. It is to rest enough to think better tomorrow. That is hard to accept if you are used to carrying everything internally, if you are the kind of person who tries to pre-solve pain before it happens. If your mind has learned that vigilance feels safer than peace. A lot of people do not stay mentally busy because they are broken. They stay mentally busy because somewhere along the way, their brain learned that being on guard feels like protection. If I think about it enough, maybe I can prevent it. If I replay it enough, maybe I can control the outcome. If I stay alert, maybe I will not get blindsided. But peace is not earned through constant surveillance. You do not protect yourself by refusing to sleep. You do not become safer by mentally bleeding over things that have not even happened yet. You just become more tired, more fragile, more likely to believe your worst thoughts. So tonight, maybe the gentlest truth is this: you are allowed to set the problem down without disrespecting it. You are allowed to care deeply and still not carry it into your sleep. You are allowed to leave some things unfinished for a few hours. The email can wait, the answer can wait, the life plan can wait, the perfect response, the self-improvement plan, the emotional breakthrough, the fear about what this all means. None of it needs to be solved in the dark. There is a version of you that will meet this again tomorrow with more steadiness, more oxygen, more perspective. And that version of you deserves a rested brain, not a punished one. So if your mind keeps trying to reopen every file tonight, you do not have to follow it into every room. You can notice the thought and let it remain unsolved. You can let today stay incomplete. You can let the unanswered parts of your life be unanswered for a few hours longer. Nothing real will be lost by sleeping, and if something truly matters, it will still be there in the morning. Only then, you will not be meeting it as someone depleted and cornered by the dark. You will be meeting it as someone who gave themselves the one thing most people deny themselves when they need it most: mercy. You are still worthy even when you feel unproductive. Some of the cruelest things people believe about themselves are not dramatic. They sound reasonable, mature even. They sound like discipline, like standards, like ambition. They sound like I will feel better about myself once I get more done, once I catch up, once I become more consistent, once I stop wasting time, once I finally prove I am not falling behind. And at first, that mindset can feel useful. It can get you moving. It can make you feel in control. It can even look admirable from the outside. But over time, it starts doing something dangerous. It quietly teaches you to treat your own worth like a reward system, something to be earned after output, after performance, after enough visible evidence that you are doing life correctly. And once that belief settles in, rest stops feeling like rest. It starts feeling suspicious. A slow day feels like failure. A quiet week feels like regression. A tired mind feels like weakness. And suddenly, even when nobody is pressuring you, you are still carrying this private panic that says, if I am not producing, I am disappearing. That is such a painful way to live, because it means your nervous system never actually gets to unclench. You are not just trying to finish tasks. You are trying to secure your right to feel okay. You are trying to earn self-respect through motion. And the worst part is, it never fully works. Because if your worth depends on productivity, then no amount of productivity will ever feel like enough. There is always one more thing you could have done. One more habit you could have fixed. One more hour you could have used better. One more version of yourself you could have become by now. That is not motivation. That is emotional debt. And a lot of people do not even realize they are living inside it. You see it in the way someone cannot enjoy a free afternoon without guilt. In the way they feel uneasy during rest, like they should be optimizing something. In the way they judge themselves more harshly for being tired than they would ever judge someone they love. They are not just busy. They are bonded to the idea that being useful is what makes them lovable. That belief does not come from nowhere. For a lot of people, it started early. Maybe praise came most easily when you were doing well, when you were achieving, helping, performing, being easy, being impressive, being dependable. Maybe you learned that your value became more visible when you were succeeding, and less visible when you were struggling. So your brain adapted. It made a simple, heartbreaking equation. If I do more, I matter more. And if that equation has been running in the background for years, of course stillness feels uncomfortable. Of course doing nothing can feel emotionally unsafe. Because to a mind shaped by conditional worth, rest is not neutral. It feels like risk. But here is the truth that can feel almost offensive at first. Your value does not rise and fall with your output. Not because that sounds nice. Not because it is a comforting quote people post online. But because productivity and worth are not measuring the same thing. One measures what got done. The other measures something much deeper. Your humanity, your presence, your aliveness. your ability to feel, connect, endure, care, recover, begin again. And none of those things disappear just because you had a slow day. A machine loses value when it stops producing. A human being does not. That difference matters more than most people realize, because when you start seeing yourself like a machine, you become less compassionate with your own limitations. You stop interpreting exhaustion as information and start interpreting it as failure. You stop asking what you need and start asking what is wrong with you. You turn every low-energy season into a character flaw. Every pause becomes proof that you are lazy, behind, wasting your life. But sometimes you are not lazy. Sometimes you are mentally overloaded. Sometimes your body is carrying stress you have not fully named. Sometimes you are grieving. Sometimes you are burned out in a way that does not look dramatic enough to justify your own softness. Sometimes your brain is simply asking for repair, and you keep answering it with shame. That is where so many people get stuck. Because shame is a terrible fuel source. It can make you move, yes, but it cannot make you feel safe while moving. It cannot create peace. It cannot create self-trust. It just teaches you to keep going while quietly resenting yourself. And that is not the same thing as living well. There is also something else people rarely admit. Some of your most important seasons will not look impressive from the outside. Healing does not always look productive. Rebuilding your sense of self does not always come with visible milestones. Learning how to regulate your emotions, set boundaries, recover from disappointment, or survive a chapter that drained you may not produce a neat list of accomplishments. But that does not mean nothing valuable is happening. Some of the most meaningful work you will ever do in your life will happen invisibly. It will happen when you choose not to abandon yourself on a hard day, when you let your body rest before it breaks, when you stop treating every unproductive moment like evidence against your character, when you allow yourself to exist without constantly auditioning for your own approval. That kind of inner shift does not usually get applause, but it changes everything, because the moment you stop tying your worth to your usefulness, your whole life softens. Rest becomes cleaner, work becomes healthier, discipline becomes less punishing. You stop needing every day to prove something about who you are, and maybe that is what you need to hear tonight. If today was messy, slow, inconsistent, unfocused, or unfinished, it did not erase your worth. If you needed more rest than progress, that does not make you less admirable. If all you did today was survive your own mind, hold yourself together, and make it to this moment, that still counts as a life being lived. You do not need to earn the right to be treated gently by yourself. You do not need to become more efficient before you deserve peace. You are still worthy in the middle of the unfinished, the low energy, the paused version of your life. Not later when you have done enough. Now, your mind is allowed to be tired without meaning you are failing. There is a very specific kind of fear that shows up when your mind gets tired. Not physical tired. Not just the kind where your body wants sleep. I mean the deeper kind. The kind where your thoughts feel heavy. Your attention slips more easily. Simple things take longer. Conversations feel harder to hold. Even deciding what to eat or what to reply can feel weirdly overwhelming, and almost immediately this panic starts creeping in underneath it all. What is wrong with me lately? Why can I not handle what I used to? Why does everything feel harder than it should? And that is where so many people suffer in silence. Because mental exhaustion does not just make life harder, it also makes you question your own identity while it is happening. You are not only tired, you are scared that the tiredness means something permanent about you. Something ugly. Something disappointing. Something that confirms your worst fear, which is that maybe you are not as capable as you thought. That is such a painful place to be, because when the mind is tired, it does not interpret itself kindly. It does not say, you have been carrying a lot. It does not say, maybe you need recovery. It says you are slipping. And once that thought lands, everything starts feeling like evidence. You forget a small task, and suddenly it feels like proof you are becoming unreliable. You struggle to focus, and it feels like proof you are losing discipline. You need more quiet than usual, and it feels like proof you are becoming weak. You cannot show up with your usual energy, and now you are secretly wondering if everyone can tell that something is off. But here is the truth that exhausted people almost never give themselves permission to believe. A tired mind is not a broken mind, and it is definitely not a failed one, because the brain is not designed to operate at full emotional, cognitive, and social capacity forever. It is not supposed to keep absorbing stress, decisions, noise, pressure, uncertainty, emotional labor, and overstimulation without eventually asking for some kind of pause. But the way modern life is built, people are constantly overriding that pause. They keep going while depleted. They keep performing while internally foggy. They keep demanding clarity from a mind that has been running on too little rest, too much input, and almost no softness. And then they blame themselves when the system starts lagging. That is like driving a car for months without maintenance and then feeling ashamed when the engine starts sounding strange. The problem is not always your character. Sometimes it is just strain. Sometimes it is cumulative. And mental exhaustion is sneaky because it does not always arrive dramatically. It can build so slowly that you barely notice it happening. You just start feeling less like yourself, less sharp, less motivated, less emotionally available, less patient, less interested in things that usually help. You still function enough to keep going, which makes it easier to dismiss. But inside, everything starts feeling like it requires more effort than it should. That is not laziness, that is load, and your brain keeps a score most people never fully see. Every unresolved stressor, every conversation you are still carrying, every pressure you keep minimizing, every disappointment you brushed past too quickly, every time you had to be okay before you actually were, every alert, every screen, every decision, every emotional suppression, every small daily demand that seems harmless on its own but stacks into something heavy over time. Your mind does not just process the big breakdowns. It absorbs the drip of ordinary overwhelm too. So when your thoughts feel slower lately, it may not mean you are becoming less capable. It may mean your system is full. And if you have been trying to survive life while secretly criticizing yourself for not doing it more gracefully, that criticism is probably making the exhaustion worse. Because one of the most draining things a person can do is be tired and ashamed at the same time. That combination is brutal. Now you are not just carrying the original stress, you are also carrying the fear that your response to the stress is somehow unacceptable. You are tired, and then you judge yourself for being tired. You need rest, and then you make the need itself feel embarrassing. You start acting like your humanity is an inconvenience. And that is where so much unnecessary suffering gets created. Because once shame enters the picture, recovery becomes harder. Rest does not feel restful anymore if your inner voice is turning it into a moral failure. Slowing down does not help if you spend the whole time panicking that you are falling behind. You cannot heal properly while treating your own exhaustion like a personal defect. This is why so many people think they need more discipline when what they actually need is nervous system relief. Not more pressure, not more self-correction, not another harsh internal speech about how you need to get it together. Sometimes what helps most is a quieter truth, that your mind might not be malfunctioning. It might just be overworked, and if that is true, then this season does not need to be interpreted as some final statement about who you are. It does not mean you are losing your edge. It does not mean you are secretly incapable. It does not mean everyone else can handle life better than you, and you are just not built for it. It may simply mean you have reached the point where your brain is asking to be treated like something living instead of something extractable. That changes the whole conversation. Because if your mind is tired, the question is no longer what is wrong with me. The question becomes, what have I been carrying for too long without enough recovery? That is a much more honest question, and a much kinder one. Maybe tonight you do not need to fix your mind. Maybe you just need to stop turning its tiredness into a verdict. You are allowed to have a foggy season without calling yourself lost. You are allowed to need more quiet without calling yourself weak. You are allowed to feel mentally worn down without making it mean you are failing at life. Because being tired is not the same thing as being incapable, and a mind asking for rest is not a mind that has given up. It is a mind that has been trying very hard for a very long time, and that deserves tenderness, not punishment. So if your thoughts feel slower tonight, if your focus has not been what it used to be, if your inner world has felt heavier than usual, Maybe the most soothing truth is this: your mind is allowed to be tired. And that tiredness does not cancel your strength. It does not erase your intelligence. It does not make you less worthy of peace. It just means you are human. And humans are not meant to carry everything forever. You do not have to earn rest by suffering. There is a quiet kind of damage that happens when a person starts believing rest has to be deserved, not wanted, not needed, earned. And once that belief gets deep enough, it starts shaping your whole life in ways you do not even notice at first. You stop asking yourself whether you need a break and start asking whether you have done enough to be allowed one. You stop seeing rest as part of being human and start treating it like a prize at the end of suffering. Something you get only after the work is done. The stress is justified, the exhaustion is visible, and the day has wrung every last drop out of you. Until then, stopping feels wrong. It feels lazy, premature, almost dishonest, like you are trying to take something you have not yet paid for. And that belief can look very normal from the outside. It can even look admirable. It can look like discipline, drive, ambition, resilience. But underneath it, there is usually something much sadder going on. A person who has quietly learned that their needs only matter once they become severe enough to interrupt performance. A person who has learned to ignore small signals from their body and wait until those signals turn into collapse. A person who does not rest when they are tired, but only when they are completely emptied out and have no other choice. That is not strength. That is survival dressed up as self-control, and the reason this belief is so dangerous is because it does not just affect how you rest. It affects how you relate to yourself. If rest has to be earned, then your body is never allowed to just be tired. It has to prove it. Your mind is never allowed to just be overloaded. It has to break down enough for you to finally take it seriously. Your emotions are never allowed to simply ask for care. They have to become unmanageable before you grant yourself softness. So now your relationship with your own needs becomes adversarial. You do not respond to them. You negotiate with them, delay them, minimize them, distrust them. And after a while, that creates a really painful pattern. You become someone who can only stop when you are suffering enough to justify it, which means peace never arrives early. It only arrives late, after the burnout, after the shutdown, after the tears, after the numbness, after the body starts forcing what the mind kept postponing. That is a brutal way to live because it means rest is never clean. It is always contaminated by guilt. Even when you finally slow down, some part of you is still trying to calculate whether you deserve to be there, whether you worked hard enough, whether you pushed enough, whether your exhaustion is legitimate enough to count. And if you have ever felt unable to relax on a day off, unable to enjoy doing nothing, unable to sit still without hearing this low-level accusation in the background telling you that you should be doing more, that is usually where it comes from. Not laziness, not lack of discipline. A nervous system that has been trained to believe stillness is only safe after depletion. And that training usually starts earlier than people think. Sometimes it comes from growing up in environments where rest was treated like laziness and overworking was treated like virtue. Sometimes it comes from households where your value became most visible when you were useful, productive, high-functioning, low-maintenance. Sometimes it comes from emotional survival, where staying busy became a way to avoid feeling things you did not know how to carry. And sometimes it just comes from living in a culture that constantly rewards burnout and then acts confused when everyone is falling apart. But no matter where it came from, the lie stays the same. You can rest later, you can stop later, you can take care of yourself after you have pushed harder, done more, suffered enough. And that lie keeps people exhausted for years. Because the truth is, your body does not need to be on the edge of collapse before it is allowed relief. Your mind does not need to hit some dramatic breaking point before it deserves quiet. You do not need to bleed for your rest. You do not need to hit rock bottom to earn a soft place to land. That is not how healthy things work. Think about how gently you would treat someone you love if they were clearly running on empty. You would not say, "Keep going until you completely fall apart, and then maybe you can lie down." You would not tell them to wait until their suffering becomes more impressive. You would not demand a breakdown as proof that they have earned a pause. You would tell them to rest before it gets worse, to listen sooner, to stop before the damage deepens. So why is it so easy to deny that same wisdom to yourself? Why do you keep acting like your pain has to become undeniable before it counts? A lot of people think they are being tough when they ignore their limits, but often they are just being unkind to themselves in a way they have normalized. They are waiting for permission that should have never been necessary in the first place, because rest is not compensation for suffering. It is maintenance, it is care, it is part of how a human being remains human. Sleep is not something you earn by overworking. Quiet is not something you unlock by finally becoming exhausted enough. Slowing down is not weakness. It is one of the few ways the mind and body get a chance to repair what daily life keeps wearing down. And the strange thing is, people often become more emotionally stable, more focused, more patient, and more capable once they stop making rest conditional. Not because they became softer in a bad way, but because they finally stopped draining themselves just to feel worthy of stopping. They stopped turning basic care into a moral achievement. Maybe that is what needs to sink in tonight. You do not have to prove your exhaustion before you honor it. You do not have to complete one more task, survive one more hard day, or push yourself into one more wall before you are allowed to let go. If you are tired, that is already enough information. If your mind is asking for quiet, that is already enough reason. If your body wants stillness, that is already valid. You do not have to earn rest by suffering first. Rest was never supposed to be a reward for how much pain you could endure. It was supposed to be something you were allowed to receive while you were still whole. Who you are is deeper than what you achieved today. One of the easiest traps to fall into without realizing it is waking up as a human being and going to bed feeling like a scoreboard. Not a person, not a soul, not a mind carrying a full inner world, just a quiet calculation of what got done and what did not. And once that habit takes hold, it becomes frighteningly easy to reduce an entire day of your life into a single emotional verdict, productive or wasted, good or bad, worth something or worth less. You might have felt things, helped someone, survived something heavy, kept yourself together, held back words you were proud not to say, made it through a hard hour nobody else saw. But if the list stayed unfinished, your brain still tries to stamp the day as inadequate, like your existence became smaller because your output did. That is such a painful way to live, because it teaches you to look at your life through the narrowest possible lens. It teaches you to overlook everything that cannot be measured and then act as if the measurable parts are the only ones that count. So now your worth starts getting quietly tied to things that are visible, trackable, easy to compare, tasks completed, goals hit, messages answered, plans followed, boxes checked. And every time the day ends without enough evidence of progress, you feel this low-level disappointment that is much deeper than it looks. Not just frustration that you did not do enough, but this private fear that maybe you were not enough. And when that pattern gets strong enough, it starts stealing from you in ways that are hard to notice at first. You stop experiencing your life while it is happening because you are too busy measuring it. You stop asking whether a day was meaningful and only ask whether it was efficient. You stop noticing your emotional effort, your resilience, your honesty, your tenderness, your patience, your attempts to keep going, because none of those things fit neatly into the kind of success your brain has been trained to recognize. So you can live a whole day full of invisible courage and still go to sleep feeling like you failed. That is the part that hurts. Because a lot of the most important things a human being does in a day are not the things the world claps for. Sometimes the biggest thing you did today was not quitting. Sometimes it was getting out of bed while carrying a heaviness nobody could see. Sometimes it was choosing not to spiral. Sometimes it was holding your tongue when you could have said something cruel. Sometimes it was making one decent decision in the middle of a messy emotional state. Sometimes it was simply staying gentle in a world that keeps trying to harden you. And none of that shows up on a productivity app. None of that looks impressive in a planner. But it still counts. It counts because you are not just here to perform tasks. You are here to live a human life. And a human life is made of far more than completed output. It is made of attention, integrity, emotional labor, recovery, reflection, connection, restraint, presence, and all the invisible ways a person keeps becoming themselves over time. That is why it is so dangerous when your mind starts confusing achievement with identity. Because achievement is something you do. Identity is something you are, and the moment those two things collapse into each other, every unfinished task starts feeling personal. Every low-energy day starts feeling like a flaw in your character. Every slow season starts sounding like a verdict on your value. You are no longer just disappointed that you did not achieve more. You are quietly afraid that there is not enough to you without achievement there to validate your existence. That fear runs deeper than most people admit. A lot of people are not actually chasing success as much as they are chasing the feeling of being enough. They want the accomplishment, yes, but even more than that, they want what they hope it will finally prove, that they matter, that they are not behind, that they are not wasting their life, that they are not forgettable, that they can finally relax and feel secure in themselves. But the problem is, if you use achievement to answer an identity question, the answer never sticks. It feels good for a minute, maybe even a week, but then the hunger comes back. Because deep down, your soul knows the difference between being valuable and being validated, and one can never permanently replace the other. That is why someone can accomplish a lot and still feel strangely empty at night, because no amount of external progress can fully soothe the pain of not knowing how to value yourself outside of performance. If your self-worth is built entirely on what you produce, then every pause becomes threatening, every quiet day becomes suspicious, every version of you that is not actively achieving starts to feel harder to love. But who you are was never supposed to be that fragile. You are not only the part of you that executes, you are also the part that feels deeply, notices beauty, cares about people, carries memories, learns slowly, heals imperfectly, survives things privately, and keeps trying to become more honest over time. You are your conscience, your softness, your humor, your sensitivity, your restraint, your inner life, your way of seeing the world, your way of loving, your way of enduring. None of that disappears just because today was not especially productive. And if you are in a season where your mind keeps trying to grade your life every night before bed, maybe this is the truth it needs to hear. A day can be unfinished without being meaningless. A day can be quiet without being wasted. A day can be slow without subtracting from who you are, because the deepest parts of you are not on trial every time the checklist stays incomplete. You are still you on the low-output days. Still worthy, still whole, still real, still becoming. And maybe tonight, instead of asking what did I achieve today, there is a better question. Who was I today underneath the performance? Were you honest? Were you trying? Were you kind when it would have been easier not to be? Did you stay with yourself through something difficult? Did you make it through in one piece? Did you keep going in some small human way? If so, then more happened today than your anxious mind is willing to count, because who you are is deeper than what you achieved today. And that depth does not disappear just because the day ended before you could prove it. Not every unanswered question is a danger. Some questions feel heavier at night than they ever deserved to feel in the first place. During the day, they might sit quietly in the background. Annoying, maybe. Unresolved, definitely. But manageable. Then nighttime comes, and suddenly the same unanswered thing starts feeling emotionally radioactive. Now it is not just a question. It is a threat, a warning, a sign that something is wrong, unstable, unfinished, unsafe. And before you even realize what is happening, your whole nervous system is leaning toward it like, if you do not solve it immediately, something bad is going to happen. That reaction is more common than people realize. A lot of us have been trained, either by life or by pain or by uncertainty we never fully processed, to treat the unknown like an emergency. If something is unclear, we assume it is dangerous. If someone has not replied, we assume something is off. If the future is not mapped out, we assume we are behind. If a relationship feels undefined, we assume we are at risk. If we cannot make sense of what we are feeling, we assume we are unraveling. The mind does this very quickly. It takes ambiguity and turns it into alarm, and once that pattern is in place, peace becomes hard to access, because life is full of unanswered things. And if your nervous system interprets every open loop as a threat, then your body never really gets permission to relax. That is exhausting. It means your mind is constantly scanning for certainty, as if certainty is the only thing standing between you and disaster. So now, instead of simply living your life, you are also trying to mentally secure every edge of it. You want to know where this relationship is going. You want to know if that opportunity will work out. You want to know if you made the right choice. You want to know if people really mean what they say. You want to know if your future will be okay. You want to know if the version of you that is trying so hard is actually getting anywhere. And because so much of that cannot be answered right now, your brain starts doing what anxious brains do best. It tries to manufacture certainty through overthinking. Maybe if I replay the conversation enough, I will finally understand what they meant. Maybe if I mentally walk through every possible outcome, I will be prepared. Maybe if I keep thinking about this long enough, I can force clarity before it naturally arrives. But the problem is, overthinking does not usually give you peace. It gives you the illusion of involvement. It makes you feel like you are doing something while actually deepening the very tension you are trying to escape. And this is where a lot of people get trapped without realizing it. They are not just bothered by uncertainty, they are convinced uncertainty itself is unsafe. Which means the real suffering is not always the unanswered question. It is the meaning their mind attaches to the fact that it is still unanswered. That is such an important difference. Because an unanswered question is not automatically a red flag. Sometimes it is just a question that needs more time. Sometimes it is a conversation that has not happened yet. Sometimes it is a decision that is not ready to reveal itself. Sometimes it is a chapter of life that is still unfolding in real time, and your mind is demanding a final answer from a story that is still being written. And that demand can quietly ruin your ability to be where you are. Because if you keep insisting that peace can only exist after everything is explained, clarified, resolved, and guaranteed, then peace will always stay just out of reach. Life does not offer that kind of certainty, not to anyone. And yet, people still survive, they still love, they still choose, they still heal, they still move forward carrying unanswered things. That matters, because one of the deepest forms of emotional maturity is learning that uncertainty is uncomfortable without automatically treating it like danger. That does not mean every unknown is harmless. Sometimes your confusion is trying to tell you something important. Sometimes lack of clarity is a sign that a boundary needs to be set or a truth needs to be faced. But not every unclear thing is a warning siren. Not every delayed answer is rejection. Not every open ending is loss. Not every mystery is your cue to panic. Sometimes your nervous system is reacting to old fear, not current reality. That happens more than people think. If you have ever been blindsided, abandoned, disappointed, misled, or emotionally unsafe in the past, your brain may have learned to become hyper-alert around uncertainty. It may have started believing that unanswered things are where pain hides. So now your body does not wait for proof. It reacts preemptively. It tries to close every gap before anything can hurt you again. That is understandable. But it also means your mind may be assigning danger to situations that are simply unfinished, not threatening. And if that is happening, the most healing thing may not be getting all the answers tonight. It may be learning how to stay grounded while not having them. That is a very different kind of strength, not the kind that solves everything on command. The kind that can tolerate not knowing without collapsing into fear. The kind that can say, I do not have clarity yet, but that does not mean I am in danger. The kind that can leave a question open without treating it like a wound. That is not easy, especially if your mind is used to equating uncertainty with helplessness. But it is one of the gentlest truths you can give yourself at night, when every unknown tries to grow teeth in the dark. You do not need every answer before you are allowed to rest. You do not need every outcome mapped before you are allowed to breathe. You do not need to decode every silence, predict every possibility, or resolve every unfinished thought before sleep. Some things are still becoming clear. Some things are still on their way to revealing themselves. And some things are simply not yours to know yet. That does not mean you are unsafe. It does not mean something is wrong. It just means you are living a human life, and human lives contain loose ends, pauses, waiting periods, and chapters that do not explain themselves right away. So if your mind is trying to turn every unknown into an emergency tonight, maybe this is the truth it needs instead. Not every unanswered question is a danger. Some are just unfinished, and unfinished does not mean unsafe. You are not behind in life, you are simply living at a human pace. There is a very specific kind of panic that can settle into a person without making much noise at first. It does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it just sounds like this quiet pressure in the background of your day telling you that you should be further along by now. That somehow, without anyone formally announcing it, life has become a race and you are losing. You look around and other people seem to be moving faster, deciding faster, succeeding faster, healing faster, figuring themselves out faster. And even if nobody says anything to your face, you still feel it. That low, constant H that says you are late to your own life. It is one of the loneliest feelings because it can make everything you do feel slightly contaminated. You cannot just enjoy where you are because part of you is always comparing it to where you think you should be. You cannot fully rest because rest starts feeling expensive. You cannot move at your natural rhythm because you are too busy mentally checking whether that rhythm looks acceptable next to everybody else's timeline. So even your ordinary days start carrying this strange emotional tension, like you are always one step behind some invisible schedule you were supposed to follow, but never actually agreed to. And the worst part is how believable that feeling can become. Because there is always evidence if your mind wants to find it. Someone younger doing something impressive. Someone your age hitting milestones you have not hit yet. Someone online making your life look smaller without even trying. A relationship you thought would have happened by now. A version of stability you thought you would already have. A level of confidence, clarity, success, peace, or self-understanding you thought would have arrived by this point. And when those things are missing, your brain can start building a very cruel story out of that absence. A story that says if it has not happened yet, something must be wrong with you. That story hurts because it does not just create impatience, it creates shame. Now you are not only wanting your life to move forward, you are quietly embarrassed that it has not unfolded the way you imagined. You start feeling like you missed some developmental train that everybody else somehow caught. And from there, it gets harder to see your life clearly because comparison distorts everything. It does not just show you where others are, it erases context, it erases grief, it erases timing, it erases what each person had to survive, what they had access to, what they sacrificed, what they hid, what they inherited, what they are privately carrying. Comparison takes all of that and flattens life into a scoreboard, and human lives were never meant to be read that way. Because the truth is, a lot of what people call being behind is actually just being human in a world that rewards speed more than depth. It is human to take longer than expected to heal from what hurt you. It is human to need more time to become who you are. It is human to outgrow one version of your life before you know what the next one is. It is human to be uncertain, to restart, to move slowly, to pause, to question everything, to take the scenic route through your own becoming. But when you are surrounded by a culture that constantly glorifies acceleration, normal human pacing starts to feel like failure. Slowness gets misread as incompetence, rest gets misread as laziness, reflection gets misread as hesitation, taking your time gets treated like a flaw instead of what it often is, which is intelligence, care, and emotional honesty. A lot of people are not actually behind. They are just refusing to force a life that is not ready to happen yet. And that deserves more respect than it usually gets, because some of the most damaging decisions people make come from the fear of being late. They rush into relationships because they think they are running out of time. They choose careers they do not actually want because everyone around them seems more established. They stay in versions of themselves that no longer fit because reinvention feels too slow and too inconvenient. They force timelines that look good from the outside and then wonder why their life feels disconnected from who they really are. Speed can make things happen, but it cannot make them right, and there is a huge difference between movement and alignment. That is why a life that unfolds more slowly is not automatically a life that is going badly. Sometimes it is just a life being built with more honesty, more recovery, more self-awareness, more room for mistakes, more time to become solid instead of just impressive, And yes, that can be uncomfortable to live through, especially when your mind keeps trying to turn every delay into a verdict. Especially when your nervous system interprets other people's progress like proof that you are failing. Especially when you are tired of waiting for your own life to feel like it is clicking into place. But being in process is not the same thing as being lost. Being unfinished is not the same thing as being behind, and taking longer does not mean you are doing life wrong. Sometimes it means you are doing it in a way that your future self will actually be able to live with. That matters more than people admit, because what is the point of arriving quickly if you arrive disconnected from yourself? What is the point of hitting the milestone if you had to abandon your nervous system, your peace, your values, or your truth to get there? What is the point of keeping up if the version of life you are keeping up with does not even feel like yours? A lot of people spend years trying to match a pace that was never meant for them, and it leaves them deeply tired. So maybe tonight, instead of measuring your life against a timeline that keeps making you feel defective, there is a softer and more honest truth to hold. You are not a machine built for constant acceleration. You are a person, a living, feeling, changing person, and people need time. Time to understand themselves, time to recover from what shaped them, time to build a life that actually fits, time to let things ripen instead of forcing them before they are ready. That is not failure. That is wisdom most people only learn after they burn themselves out trying to move faster than their soul can handle. So if life has felt slower than you wanted lately, if things are not landing as quickly as you hoped, if your path looks less polished or less predictable than other people's, that does not automatically mean you are late. It may simply mean you are moving at a human pace. And a human pace is not something to be ashamed of. It is often where the real life happens. Being sensitive does not mean you are weak. There is a kind of person who walks through the world feeling everything a little more than they know how to explain. A tone shift in someone's voice, the heaviness in a room no one else seems to notice, the strange ache that comes after a conversation that looked normal on the surface but felt off underneath, the way certain words linger for hours, the way disappointment can sit in the chest long after the moment has passed, the way beauty can hit so hard it almost hurts. Music, silence, tension, tenderness, distance, rejection, affection, the emotional weather of other people. Some people just absorb more of it. And if you are one of those people, there is a good chance you have spent at least part of your life wondering whether that means something is wrong with you. Not because sensitivity is actually wrong, but because the world does not always know what to do with people who feel deeply. It tends to reward hardness, efficiency, detachment, speed, emotional control that looks clean from the outside. So if you are the kind of person who gets overwhelmed more easily, who notices everything, who needs more time to process, who feels affected by things other people seem to brush off, it can start to feel like you are carrying some private defect. Like everyone else got the manual on how to be tougher, and you somehow missed it. That belief can become incredibly painful because it does not just make you feel emotional, it makes you feel ashamed of being emotional. Now you are not only having the feeling, you are also judging yourself for having it. You are sad and embarrassed about being sad, overstimulated and angry at yourself for being overstimulated, hurt and then immediately trying to act like you should not be hurt. And once that pattern takes over, you can spend years trying to edit yourself into someone less affected, less porous, less intense, less you. A lot of sensitive people do this without realizing it. They start rehearsing indifference because they think indifference looks stronger. They stop speaking up about what affects them because they do not want to seem dramatic. They pretend things do not get to them when they absolutely do. They force themselves to stay in environments that are too loud, too harsh, too emotionally unsafe, because they are afraid that honoring their limits will make them look fragile. So now they are not just carrying the original emotional weight, they are also carrying the exhaustion of constantly performing a version of toughness that does not actually fit. That is a brutal way to live because it turns your natural wiring into a battle. And the saddest part is that sensitivity is so often misunderstood. People confuse sensitivity with instability, with overreaction, with weakness. But those are not the same thing. Sensitivity does not mean you are incapable. It means your system registers more. You notice more, you process more, you feel more texture in human experience. That can absolutely become overwhelming when it is unsupported or shamed, but in itself, it is not a flaw. It is a form of depth, and depth comes with weight. Think about what sensitivity actually allows a person to do. It lets you read a room before words are even spoken. It lets you feel what others miss. It lets you connect deeply, create honestly, love carefully, empathize naturally, notice beauty, catch emotional nuance, sense when something is off, and respond to life with real texture instead of numbness. Those are not weak qualities. Those are powerful ones. The problem is that they are often invisible until the right context reveals them. That is why so many sensitive people grow up feeling wrong in environments that were simply too harsh for their nervous system. They assume they are the issue when sometimes the truth is they were just never in spaces that knew how to hold them properly. So they adapt by hardening where they can, numbing where they can, shrinking where they can, and eventually they start mistaking self-abandonment for maturity. But shutting down your sensitivity does not make you stronger. It just makes you farther away from yourself. And yes, sensitivity can be inconvenient. It can make conflict hit harder. It can make overstimulation arrive faster. It can make heartbreak, uncertainty, rejection, and chaos feel heavier than they seem to feel for other people. That part is real. But difficulty is not the same thing as weakness. Something can require more care without being defective. A finely tuned instrument needs different handling than a brick. That does not make the instrument inferior. It just means it was built for a different kind of impact. The issue is not that you feel deeply. The issue is what you have been taught to believe about people who do. If you have spent years internalizing the idea that the strongest people are the ones who are least affected, then of course your own tenderness starts to feel like a liability. But that idea is not even true. Some of the strongest people in the world are deeply sensitive. They are just not always loud about it. Their strength is not in never feeling. Their strength is in continuing to show up while feeling so much, in staying kind without becoming naive, in staying open without becoming careless, in remaining soft in places where bitterness would have been easier. That takes an enormous amount of inner strength, probably more than people realize, because numbness can look powerful, but often it is just armor. Sensitivity, when it is supported instead of shamed, can become discernment, compassion, creativity, emotional intelligence, intuition, presence, the kind of strength that does not need to dominate in order to be real. So maybe the problem is not that you are too sensitive. Maybe the problem is that you have been measuring your strength using a definition that was never built for someone like you. Maybe you have been trying to become less affected when what you actually need is to become less ashamed of being affected. That changes everything. Because once sensitivity stops being treated like a defect, it becomes something you can work with instead of something you are constantly trying to hide. You stop asking, how do I become harder, and start asking, how do I care for myself well enough to stay open without drowning? You stop treating your emotional depth like a burden and start recognizing it as part of your design. And maybe tonight, that is the truth your mind needs to rest inside. Feeling deeply does not make you fragile. Needing gentleness does not make you lesser. Being affected does not make you incapable. You do not have to become colder to be strong. You do not have to stop feeling in order to survive. Being sensitive does not mean you are weak. It may simply mean you were built to experience life with more depth than the world always knows how to honor. And that is not something to be ashamed of. That is something to protect. The version of you that survived hard days is still here tonight. There are nights when the weight of everything you have carried starts to feel strangely invisible. Not because it was small, but because you got used to holding it. That is one of the hardest things about surviving difficult seasons. The fact that once you make it through them, people often only see that you are still standing. They do not always see what it cost you to stay standing. They do not see the nights you had to talk yourself through, the mornings you had to drag yourself into, the conversations you barely made it through while pretending you were fine, the versions of you that had to keep functioning even when your inner world felt like it was caving in. And after a while, even you can forget. You can become so focused on what is still unresolved, what still hurts, what still feels unfinished, that you stop recognizing the simple fact that you are here, not in some shallow motivational way. In a real way. You are here after days that genuinely could have flattened you, after moments that changed something in you, after stretches of life where you did not know how you were going to carry it all and somehow still did. Maybe not beautifully, maybe not gracefully, maybe not in a way anyone would write a speech about. But you did, and that matters more than your mind usually lets it. Because the human brain has a very frustrating habit. It adapts to survival so quickly that once the emergency passes, it starts minimizing what happened. It says, well, you got through it, so maybe it was not that bad. Maybe you are being dramatic. Maybe other people have had it worse. Maybe you should be over it by now. Maybe the fact that you are still affected means you are weak. And that is such a cruel distortion because it erases the full truth. Survival does not mean something was easy. It just means you found a way through it. That distinction matters tonight. Because if you have been carrying a low-level exhaustion lately, or feeling more fragile than you want to admit, or wondering why certain things still affect you even though time has passed, part of the answer may be this. You are not just dealing with today, you are also living in the aftershocks of all the days that asked too much of you. That is real. A lot of people think they are failing in the present, when actually they are still recovering from what the past demanded. They look at their tiredness and call it laziness. They look at their caution and call it weakness. They look at their emotional sensitivity and call it dysfunction. But sometimes what you are feeling is not evidence that something is wrong with you. Sometimes it is evidence that you survived things your nervous system has not fully finished processing yet. That does not make you broken. It makes you human. And maybe the most important thing to remember is that the version of you who made it through those hard days did not disappear just because tonight feels heavy again. That version of you is not gone. They are still here, maybe quieter now, maybe more tired than before, maybe less dramatic than the version in your memory, but still here, still inside you, still part of your wiring, still the proof that you can endure things you once thought might undo you. That is easy to forget when you are in a low moment. Because pain has a way of shrinking your memory. It makes the current feeling seem permanent and the past strength feel far away. It convinces you that because you feel overwhelmed now, you must have lost whatever resilience once got you through. But resilience does not always look like confidence. Sometimes it looks like getting through the night without spiraling. Sometimes it looks like not giving up on yourself after a hard week. Sometimes it looks like crying and still continuing. Sometimes it looks like being scared and still staying. Strength is not always loud. A lot of the strongest parts of you have probably never looked impressive from the outside. The version of you that survived may not have looked polished. They may have looked messy, uncertain, deeply emotional, and completely unlike the image of strength you thought strength was supposed to look like. But they were still strong, because they stayed, because they adapted, because they found a way to keep moving when stopping would have been easier, because they carried what they had to carry, even if it changed them in the process. And maybe that is another truth worth saying out loud. Just because hard days changed you does not mean they destroyed you. Yes, some things probably softened. Some things probably hardened. Some parts of you may still feel more careful now, more alert, more tender, more tired. But change is not the same thing as ruin. You are allowed to be different after what you have lived through. You are allowed to need more gentleness now. You are allowed to move slower. You are allowed to still be learning how to feel safe again. None of that erases the strength it took to get here. In fact, it often reveals it, because people love to celebrate visible survival, the comeback, the glow up, the inspiring before and after. But quiet survival deserves just as much respect, the kind where nobody clapped, the kind where you still had responsibilities while your heart was breaking, the kind where you had to act normal while something inside you was being rearranged, the kind where you made it through one ordinary, looking day at a time, and no one really understood how much effort that took. That version of you deserves to be remembered tonight, not as someone distant, not as some past self you outgrew, but as someone still living in you. So if your mind is trying to convince you tonight that you are too tired, too fragile, too affected, too far gone, maybe answer it with something quieter and truer. I have been through hard days before. I have felt things I thought would swallow me. I have made it through versions of life I never would have chosen. And I am still here. Not because it was easy. Not because I was never shaken, but because some deep part of me kept going anyway. That part of you did not vanish. It is still here tonight, breathing beneath the tiredness, waiting beneath the doubt, still carrying the memory of every day you thought you would not make it through and somehow did. And maybe for tonight, that is enough to trust. You are allowed to outgrow versions of yourself without guilt. There is a strange kind of guilt that can show up when you start becoming someone new. Not because the change is wrong, and not because you secretly want to go backward, but because growth has a way of making you confront all the versions of yourself you can no longer fully be. And that can feel surprisingly heavy. You start noticing old habits that no longer fit, old roles you do not want to keep performing, old ways of thinking, coping, pleasing, apologizing, over-explaining, staying small, staying available, staying agreeable, staying familiar. And even when you know those versions of you were built out of survival, there can still be this quiet emotional resistance that says, "Who am I to leave that behind?" That feeling is deeper than most people realize, because outgrowing something is not always clean. Sometimes it is exciting, yes, but often it is disorienting. You are standing between who you were and who you are becoming, and both directions can feel emotionally loaded. The old self may have been limiting, but it was also known. It was practiced. It was familiar. It helped you get through certain seasons. It helped you belong in certain rooms. It helped you feel safe in certain dynamics. So even when it no longer fits, there can still be grief around loosening your grip on it. And if you are not careful, that grief can turn into guilt. Now every sign of your own growth starts feeling a little disloyal. You feel guilty for wanting different things than you used to want. Guilty for no longer having the same tolerance for chaos, disrespect, self-abandonment, or emotional confusion. Guilty for changing your boundaries. Guilty for becoming harder to access in the ways that used to cost you your peace. Guilty for not being as endlessly available, as endlessly understanding, as endlessly shape-shifting as the older version of you learned to be. But here is the truth that people need to hear more often. Outgrowing old versions of yourself is not betrayal. It is often the most honest thing you can do. Because not every version of you was built to last forever. Some versions were built to survive a certain chapter, to navigate a certain environment, to protect you when you did not yet have better tools, to earn love the only way you knew how at the time, to keep the peace, to avoid rejection, to stay chosen, to stay needed, to stay safe. And if that was the role those versions played, then they were not useless. They were necessary. They carried you. They adapted for you. They got you here. But necessary is not the same thing as permanent. That is where people get stuck. They think if a version of them once protected them, they owe it lifelong loyalty. They think if a pattern once kept them connected, they are not allowed to release it now. They think if a behavior once helped them survive, they have to keep repeating it even after it starts costing them more than it saves. And that is how people stay trapped in identities they have already outgrown. Not because they do not know better, but because they feel guilty for evolving past what once kept them afloat. That guilt can keep a person emotionally frozen for years, still being the understanding one when they are actually exhausted, still being the fixer when they are quietly falling apart, still being the smaller, easier, more self-abandoning version of themselves because other people got comfortable with that version and now growth feels like disruption. But growth is disruption. Real growth almost always inconveniences the systems, dynamics, and identities that relied on your old self staying the same. That does not make the growth selfish, it makes it real. And if you have been feeling torn lately between the comfort of who you used to be and the truth of who you are becoming, maybe what is hurting is not the change itself. Maybe it is the emotional permission you have not fully given yourself to let the old version go. Because a lot of people try to evolve while still dragging the old identity behind them, like they need to keep proving they are still the same person underneath. But you are not supposed to stay exactly the same, not after enough life, not after enough truth, not after enough self-awareness, not after enough moments where your soul quietly realizes, I cannot keep living like this and still call it peace. That realization matters, and it does not need to be defended. You are allowed to become less available to what drains you. You are allowed to become less impressed by what once distracted you. You are allowed to become less tolerant of things you used to excuse. You are allowed to want a different life than the one your old self was trying to hold together. That is not arrogance. That is not abandonment. That is what happens when a person starts respecting themselves enough to stop shrinking into outdated versions of who they had to be. And yes, some people may not understand it. Some people only know how to relate to the version of you that overextended, overexplained, overgave, overaccommodated. So when you change, it may feel to them like loss. They may call it distance. They may call it selfishness. They may call it you acting different. But different is not always a problem. Sometimes different is the first sign that healing is actually working. That is why you cannot always use other people's comfort as the measurement of whether your growth is valid. Sometimes your evolution will disappoint people who benefited from your self-abandonment. That does not mean you are wrong. It may simply mean you are no longer available in the ways that once made you easy to keep around but hard to truly protect. And that shift deserves more tenderness than shame, because becoming someone new is vulnerable enough without you also punishing yourself for it. So maybe tonight, if part of you has been clinging to an older version of yourself out of guilt, loyalty, fear, or familiarity, this is what you need to hear. You do not owe permanence to identities that were only meant to carry you through a temporary season. You do not need to keep performing an outdated self just because other people got attached to it. You do not have to apologize for becoming harder to harm. You are allowed to outgrow versions of yourself that no longer feel true, even if they once helped you survive, even if they were loved by others, even if letting them go feels emotional, because honoring who you are now is not a rejection of who you were. It is a continuation of the same life, finally being lived with more truth. And you are allowed to choose that without guilt. Your value does not disappear when nobody is watching. There is a kind of emptiness that can creep in when the world goes quiet, and there is nothing obvious reflecting you back to yourself. No messages, no praise, no one needing anything from you, no visible proof that you mattered today. And in that silence, a really painful question can start forming underneath the surface. If no one is noticing me right now, do I still count in the same way? Most people would never say that out loud, but a lot of people live with it, not in a dramatic way, in a subtle, daily way, in the way their mood rises and falls based on how responded to they feel, in the way they feel more real when they are useful, wanted, admired, productive, or included, in the way they suddenly feel strangely hollow when the attention stops, when the room clears, when the validation goes quiet and there is nothing external left to confirm that they are still significant. That kind of dependence is more common than people think because human beings are relational. We are shaped in connection. We do need to be seen. We do need warmth. We do need some form of reflection to help us understand who we are. That part is natural. The problem begins when being seen stops being something that nourishes you and starts becoming the only thing that stabilizes you. Now your sense of worth starts living outside of you. It starts depending on response, reaction, recognition, witness. And once that happens, your identity becomes incredibly vulnerable to silence. That is such a fragile place to live from, because there will always be seasons where nobody is clapping. There will be days when your effort goes unnoticed, times when your healing is private, chapters when your growth is invisible, nights when you are not being affirmed, chosen, texted back, praised, admired, or actively reminded that you matter. And if your self-worth is built entirely on being mirrored by the outside world, those quieter seasons can feel emotionally devastating, not because you have actually lost your value, but because you have lost access to the evidence you usually rely on to feel it. That is where people start confusing invisibility with insignificance, and they are not the same thing. Just because something is not being observed does not mean it has become less real. A tree does not stop growing because no one is standing there watching it happen. A wound does not stop healing because it is covered. A person does not stop mattering just because there is no audience present to affirm it. But emotionally, that can be very hard to believe if part of you has spent years learning to locate your worth through attention. Maybe you felt most valuable when you were being praised, or needed, or wanted. Maybe your role in life became tied to being the interesting one, the helpful one, the attractive one, the accomplished one, the emotionally available one, the person people reached for. And if that role shaped your identity strongly enough, then moments of quiet can start feeling like disappearance. Like if no one is reaching for you right now, maybe there is less of you here to reach for. That fear runs deeper than ego. It often touches old wounds around abandonment, neglect, exclusion, invisibility, or conditional love. Because if you learned early on that attention was tied to safety, belonging, or value, then of course being unnoticed can still stir something painful in you now. It can wake up that old feeling that says, if I am not being seen, I am at risk of not mattering. But the truth is, your value was never supposed to be this dependent on performance and witness. It was never supposed to disappear every time the room got quiet. You are not only real when someone is responding to you. You are not only lovable when someone is actively choosing you in that moment. You are not only significant when your life is visible enough to be admired. Some of the truest parts of who you are exist in places nobody sees, in the way you think when no one is around, in the battles you fight privately, in the self-control no one congratulates you for, in the quiet ways you keep choosing not to become bitter, in the effort it takes to stay gentle after life gave you reasons not to be, in the small acts of integrity, restraint, recovery, honesty, and care that never become public enough to be rewarded. That version of you still counts. In fact, that version of you may be the most real one, because being witnessed can be beautiful, but it can also be deceptive. It can pull people toward performance, toward polishing, toward becoming more concerned with being perceived well than being rooted deeply. And if you are not careful, you can spend years cultivating a self that feels impressive in public, but unstable in private, a self that knows how to shine when eyes are on you but falls apart in the quiet, because it never learned how to feel worthy without applause. That is why this matters so much, because peace becomes much more possible when your worth is no longer constantly up for negotiation based on who noticed you today. When a quiet day is no longer mistaken for a meaningless one. When being alone is no longer interpreted as being less. When you stop needing constant evidence from the outside world just to believe you still matter. That shift does not happen overnight, especially if your nervous system is used to equating attention with emotional safety. But it starts with a gentler truth than the one your fear usually offers. The silence is not always a verdict. The lack of response is not always rejection. The absence of witness is not the absence of value. And maybe tonight, if things feel especially quiet, if your mind is trying to measure your significance by who showed up for you today, who noticed you, who reached out, who affirmed your existence, this is the truth to rest inside. You are still here when no one is clapping, still whole when no one is commenting, still valuable when no one is watching, still real in the invisible hours, still worthy in the unwitnessed parts of your life. Because your value does not begin when someone notices it, and it does not disappear when they do not. It remains, even in the quiet. Especially in the quiet, you are not a burden for having needs, limits, or emotions. One of the saddest things a person can learn without ever realizing they learned it is how to feel guilty for being human. Not for doing something cruel, not for hurting someone, not for making a serious mistake, but for something much quieter than that. For needing reassurance, for getting overwhelmed, for having a limit, for wanting rest before reaching total exhaustion, for needing clarity instead of confusion, for feeling hurt by something other people might brush off, for needing space, softness, understanding, patience, or support. Somewhere along the way, a lot of people absorb the belief that if they are too emotional, too tired, too sensitive, too needy, too affected, too honest about what they can and cannot hold, they become harder to love. And once that belief gets into your system, it starts shaping everything. You begin editing yourself in real time. You stop saying you are overwhelmed and start saying you are just tired. You stop asking for reassurance and start pretending you are fine. You stop naming your limits clearly and instead stretch yourself thinner and thinner so nobody has to adjust around you. You become the person who says it is okay even when it is not, the person who apologizes for normal emotions, the person who tries to package their pain in a way that feels acceptable enough not to inconvenience anyone. And from the outside, that can look like maturity. It can look like independence, self-awareness, emotional control, being easygoing, being low maintenance. But on the inside, it often feels like quiet self-abandonment. That is what makes this so painful. A lot of people are not actually afraid of their own needs. They are afraid of what they think their needs will cost them. They are afraid that if they are too honest about what they feel, too clear about what they need, too visible in their humanity, they will become too much for other people, too heavy, too difficult, too inconvenient, too emotionally expensive. And when someone has been carrying that fear for long enough, they start trying to deserve love by being easier to handle. They become hyper-aware of their own impact, but not in a healthy way, in a self-erasing way, in a way that constantly asks, how do I make sure I do not take up more emotional space than I am allowed? That question can shape an entire life. And usually it does not come from nowhere. Most people do not randomly wake up one day and decide their needs are shameful. They learn it somewhere. Maybe you grew up around people who only responded warmly when you were calm, helpful, high-functioning, and easy to manage. Maybe your emotions were treated like disruptions instead of signals. Maybe your sadness was met with irritation, your limits were ignored, your overwhelm was minimized, or your need for comfort was treated like weakness. Maybe you learned very early that the safest version of you was the version that did not ask for much. So your nervous system adapted. It got careful. It got efficient. It learned how to become less visible in your need and more useful in your function. And maybe that adaptation helped you survive. But survival patterns are not always truth. Just because you learned how to make yourself smaller does not mean you were ever meant to stay that way. That matters because a lot of people are walking around with a completely distorted relationship to their own humanity. They think having limits means they are weak. They think having emotions means they are unstable. They think needing support means they are incapable. They think needing reassurance means they are immature. They think saying no means they are selfish. They think needing rest means they have failed at handling life correctly. And when all of those beliefs pile up together, a person can become deeply disconnected from themselves without even noticing it. They stop asking what they actually need and start asking what version of themselves will be easiest for other people to tolerate. But love was never supposed to require that kind of self-betrayal. You are not here to become so manageable that nobody ever has to make room for you. You are not here to be endlessly emotionally convenient. You are not here to carry your own exhaustion in silence just to protect everyone else from the discomfort of knowing you have a breaking point too. That is not what healthy connection asks of a person. In fact, one of the clearest signs that something is off in a relationship, a family dynamic, a friendship, or even the way you relate to yourself, is when your normal human needs start feeling like moral failures, because needing things is not the issue. The issue is usually that somewhere along the way, you were taught your needs would only be accepted if they arrived in a form that was easy, quiet, brief, and non-disruptive. But real life does not work like that. Sometimes your emotions will be messy. Sometimes your limits will inconvenience people. Sometimes your need for space will disappoint someone. Sometimes your need for clarity will make others uncomfortable. Sometimes your body and mind will ask for rest before your to-do list is complete. Sometimes you will not be able to keep giving at the level people are used to receiving from you. And none of that makes you a burden. It makes you alive. It makes you a person with a nervous system, a capacity, an inner world, and a finite amount of energy. That should not be something you have to defend. And if you have spent years feeling ashamed every time your humanity becomes visible, then of course your emotions feel heavier than they need to. Because you are not just carrying the emotion itself, you are also carrying the guilt around having it. You are not just tired, you are ashamed of being tired. You are not just overwhelmed, you are also panicking that your overwhelm makes you difficult. You are not just hurt, you are also trying to make sure your hurt does not make anyone uncomfortable. That extra layer is what crushes people. Not just the need itself, but the belief that the need makes them less lovable. But the truth is, the right people are not scared off by your humanity. Emotionally healthy love does not require you to become less real in order to stay wanted. And maybe that is the most soothing thing your mind could hear tonight, that you do not need to become easier to deserve care. You do not need to become less sensitive to deserve patience. You do not need to become less tired to deserve rest. You do not need to become less emotional to deserve gentleness. You do not need to become less complicated to deserve love. Having needs does not make you too much. Having limits does not make you difficult. Having emotions does not make you a burden. It makes you a human being. And human beings were never meant to earn their right to be held with care by pretending they do not need anything at all. You can be healing even when it feels slow and invisible. Healing is one of the few deeply important things in life that often does not feel like progress while it is actually happening. That is what makes it so frustrating and for a lot of people so discouraging. You imagine healing will feel clear when it arrives. You think there will be some obvious emotional shift, some clean turning point, some moment where you wake up and just know that the pain has loosened its grip and that you are finally moving forward. But real healing almost never happens that way. Most of the time it happens quietly, inconsistently, and in ways that are so subtle your mind completely misses them while they are unfolding. That is where a lot of people get hopeless too early, because if your only definition of progress is something dramatic, visible, or easy to measure, then healing can start to look like nothing is happening at all. You still get triggered sometimes. You still have bad nights. You still overthink things you thought you were over. You still miss people you know were not good for you. You still have days where your energy crashes, your confidence disappears, or your old patterns start whispering again. And in those moments, your brain can become incredibly cruel. It starts saying, maybe none of this is working. Maybe I am still broken. Maybe I have not changed at all. Maybe I am just going in circles and calling it growth because I do not want to admit I am stuck. That thought hurts because it sounds logical, but it usually is not true. What is often happening is much harder to notice. Healing is not just about whether pain still shows up. It is about how you meet it when it does. It is about what happens inside you now that did not happen before. Maybe you still get anxious, but now you recognize it faster. Maybe you still get hurt, but now you do not abandon yourself inside the hurt. Maybe you still have hard days, but they do not swallow you for as long. Maybe you still feel grief, anger, fear, or insecurity, but now there is a small part of you that knows those feelings are passing states, not permanent identities. That may not look dramatic from the outside, but internally, that is massive. The problem is that healing rarely gives you applause while it is happening. It often looks unimpressive in real time. It looks like leaving a conversation sooner than you used to. It looks like noticing a spiral before it fully takes over. It looks like resting before total burnout. It looks like not texting the person you know reopens wounds. It looks like crying and not making it mean you are back at the beginning. It looks like needing less explanation for your boundaries. It looks like surviving an emotional wave without turning it into a life sentence. These things do not always feel cinematic. They do not always give you that satisfying sense of arrival people imagine healing should bring. But they matter more than you think, because the deepest forms of healing are often not loud. They are structural. They are happening underneath the surface, in the way your nervous system is slowly learning that not every feeling is a threat, in the way your mind is becoming a little less brutal with you, in the way your body is beginning to trust that it does not always have to stay on guard, in the way your heart is learning, very slowly, that it can survive disappointment without collapsing into self-destruction. Those are not overnight changes. They are rewiring. And rewiring is almost always slower than the part of you that just wants relief now. That slowness can feel unbearable sometimes, especially if you have been trying hard for a long time, especially if you are tired of carrying invisible emotional labor, especially if no one around you fully sees how much effort it takes just to keep choosing healthier things in private. That is another part people do not talk about enough. Healing can be incredibly lonely because so much of it happens where no one else can witness it. People see the outside version of you. They see whether you are functioning, smiling, answering, showing up, but they do not always see the internal negotiations, the restraint, the grief, the self-talk, the moments you almost gave into old patterns and did not, the effort it takes to stay with yourself when part of you still wants to run. That invisible effort counts, even when nobody praises it, even when it feels repetitive, even when it is slower than you hoped, and maybe especially then. Because one of the biggest lies people believe when they are healing is that if it still hurts, they must not be getting better. But pain does not always mean regression. Sometimes pain is simply what it feels like when old wounds are being touched without being allowed to control your whole life anymore. Sometimes healing hurts because you are finally feeling things honestly instead of staying numb enough to avoid them. Sometimes it hurts because you are grieving what you tolerated, what you lost, what you needed and did not get, who you had to become to survive. That grief is not failure. That tenderness is not proof you are back at the start. It may actually be proof that your system is finally safe enough to process what it could not before. That is a very different story than the one your fear usually tells. So if healing has felt painfully slow lately, if you are in one of those seasons where your growth feels hard to see and your progress feels too quiet to trust, maybe this is what you need to hear tonight. Not all healing announces itself. Not all progress feels satisfying. Not all transformation comes with obvious milestones. Some of the most important change in your life will happen so gradually that your mind will call it nothing right up until the day you realize you no longer react, hurt, chase, collapse, or abandon yourself the way you once did. And that is not nothing. That is the slow, invisible work of becoming safer for yourself. So no, you do not need to be fully healed by now. You do not need dramatic evidence every week that you are changing enough. You do not need your growth to look impressive in order for it to be real. You can still be healing on the days it feels messy. You can still be healing on the nights it feels heavy. You can still be healing when all the progress is happening underground where no one can see it yet, because some of the truest healing in your life will happen long before it becomes visible. And that does not make it less real, it makes it sacred. Your mistakes are moments, not your identity. One of the fastest ways a person can suffer is by turning a moment they regret into a story about who they are. Not just I did something wrong, but something much heavier than that. I am wrong. I am the kind of person who ruins things. I am the kind of person who always messes up. I am the problem. And once the mind starts speaking in that language, it becomes incredibly hard to recover in a healthy way. Because now you are not just carrying guilt. You are carrying self-collapse. You are not just trying to process what happened. You are trying to survive what you have decided it means about you. That is where so many people get trapped. Because mistakes are painful enough on their own. The awkward thing you said, the way you handled something badly, the choice you wish you could take back, the way you reacted when you were overwhelmed, insecure, tired, defensive, scared, or not yet healed in the ways you needed to be. Those moments can stay with you. They can wake you up at night. They can make your chest tighten hours, weeks, even years later. But for a lot of people, the real damage does not come only from the mistake itself. It comes from the way the mind starts building an identity around it. And the mind is ruthless when shame gets involved. It does not say, you were struggling then. It does not say, you did not have the tools you have now. It does not say that was painful, but it is still a moment inside a much bigger life. It says, this is who you really are. That is such a dangerous distortion because once you believe that, growth starts feeling almost impossible. If the mistake is not just something you did, but proof of something fixed and rotten in you, then what exactly are you supposed to do with that? You can apologize, reflect, repair, change your behavior, learn from it. But if your identity has already fused with the worst thing you did in that moment, none of it ever feels like enough. Shame keeps you stuck because it does not actually want transformation. It wants punishment. It wants you to keep reliving the scene in your head until you feel you have suffered enough to deserve moving on. But suffering is not the same thing as accountability, and self-hatred is not the same thing as growth. That difference matters more than most people realize, because there is a huge emotional difference between saying I need to take responsibility for what I did and saying I deserve to live inside this version of myself forever. One leads to repair, the other leads to paralysis. One keeps your humanity intact while asking more of you. The other strips your humanity away and leaves you with nothing but condemnation. A lot of people think being hard on themselves is what keeps them honest. They think if they stop shaming themselves, they will become careless, selfish, lazy, morally weak. But that is not usually how change works. In fact, when people are drowning in shame, they often become less able to grow because the nervous system goes into defense collapse or avoidance. It gets harder to think clearly, harder to self-reflect honestly, harder to stay present enough to actually become different. Shame does not usually make people better. It just makes them smaller. And maybe that is what you need to hear tonight if your mind has been dragging old mistakes back into the room and trying to use them as evidence against you. A mistake is a moment where your humanity showed up imperfectly. That is all, sometimes painfully, sometimes messily, sometimes in ways that really did hurt you or someone else. But still, a moment, not your whole soul, not your final definition, not the entire truth of who you are. Because people are always larger than the worst thing they have done in one version of themselves. Human beings are not snapshots, they are living systems. They are unfinished. They are contradictory. They are capable of causing pain and still being capable of change. They are capable of acting from fear and later learning how to act from truth. They are capable of being immature in one chapter and wiser in another. That is not hypocrisy. That is development. The problem is, when you are stuck in regret, your mind stops allowing for development. It freezes you in the frame of your lowest moment and keeps presenting that version of you as if it is permanent, as if no context matters, as if no growth has happened since, as if no tenderness, no learning, no accountability, no becoming has taken place. It turns your past into a prison and then acts like staying in there is the only morally acceptable thing to do. But if you are genuinely willing to face what happened, learn from it, and become more honest because of it, then staying trapped in self-disgust is not noble. It is just another form of not moving, and maybe some part of you has confused ongoing punishment with integrity. Maybe you think if you stop hurting over it, that means you do not care enough. Maybe you think if you forgive yourself, you are letting yourself off too easily. But forgiveness is not pretending the moment did not matter. It is refusing to let that moment become your entire identity. That is not weakness. That is what allows actual change to keep happening. Because the healthiest people are not the ones who never mess up. They are the ones who know how to face themselves honestly without collapsing into self-hatred. They know how to say, yes, that was mine, and also, no, that is not the whole of me. They know how to let regret become information instead of a permanent residence. That is a much deeper form of accountability than shame will ever give you. So if your mind has been trying to drag you back into some old version of yourself tonight, some moment you wish you handled differently, some choice that still makes your stomach sink, maybe this is the truth it needs instead. You are allowed to regret what happened without turning it into a life sentence. You are allowed to learn without becoming your own executioner. You are allowed to be more than the worst moment your mind keeps replaying. Because your mistakes are real, yes, but they are still moments. And moments, no matter how painful, are not the same thing as identity. You are not the worst thing you did when you were scared, unhealed, overwhelmed, uninformed, or hurting. You are the person still here now, trying to become more honest, more careful, more awake. And that person deserves the chance to keep becoming. Not because the past did not matter, but because it did, and you are still more than it. You do not need everyone to understand you in order to be real. One of the quietest ways people lose themselves is by slowly starting to believe that if something about them cannot be easily explained, accepted, or understood by the people around them, then maybe it is not fully valid. Maybe it is too much, too strange, too complicated, too inconvenient, too hard to defend, and once that belief takes root, you can start spending an incredible amount of your life trying to translate yourself into something more digestible, something easier for other people to approve of, easier to explain, easier to justify. easier to fit into the emotional vocabulary of people who were never really trying to understand you that deeply in the first place. That is such an exhausting way to live, because it means you are not only carrying your actual experience, you are also carrying the pressure to make that experience legible enough for everyone else to validate it before you are allowed to trust it yourself. And that can happen in so many parts of life: the way you feel emotions, the pace at which you heal, the kind of relationships you want, the things that drain you, the things that matter to you, the way you process, the boundaries you need, the kind of life you are trying to build, the things you have outgrown, the things you still have not figured out, the parts of you that feel tender, nuanced, contradictory, difficult to summarize. If those parts do not line up neatly with what other people expect, there can be this subtle temptation to start doubting your own reality, to start wondering if maybe you are just being dramatic, difficult, confused, too sensitive, too intense, too slow, too private, too emotional, too different. That is where a lot of people get stuck, not because they are disconnected from themselves, but because they are too dependent on external comprehension before they let themselves fully believe what they already know inside. And to be fair, that dependence makes sense. Human beings are relational. We are shaped in connection. Being understood feels deeply regulating. It helps us feel less alone in our own mind. It can make pain lighter, truth clearer, identity steadier. So of course it hurts when the people around you do not get it. Of course it hurts when something real in you gets minimized, misunderstood, oversimplified, or judged through the lens of someone else's limitations. That kind of disconnect can feel incredibly lonely, especially when what you are carrying already feels hard to hold. But loneliness and invalidity are not the same thing. That is an important distinction, because if you are not careful, you can start using other people's understanding as the final test for whether your inner world is allowed to count. And that is a dangerous place to put your reality. Not everyone has the emotional range, life experience, patience, depth, or willingness to understand you accurately. Some people will only ever interpret you through the size of their own perspective. Some will project. Some will oversimplify. Some will need you to be easier to categorize because your complexity threatens the version of life that makes sense to them. And if you keep handing those people the authority to define what is real about you, you will end up doubting truths that never actually needed their permission. That happens all the time. A person feels deeply but starts calling themselves dramatic because others do not relate. A person needs more quiet, more space, more softness, and starts calling themselves difficult because others move faster. A person outgrows a role, a relationship, a version of life, but keeps forcing themselves to stay because nobody else seems to understand why they need to leave. A person knows something in them is changing, aging, asking for more truth, but keeps suppressing it because they cannot explain it in a way that sounds convincing enough to everyone else. And that is where self-betrayal begins. Not always in huge dramatic moments. Sometimes it begins in the tiny daily habit of distrusting what you know just because it is not being mirrored back to you clearly. But your truth does not become less true just because it is hard to explain. Your inner world does not become less real just because other people cannot access it fully. And your needs, limits, grief, healing, sensitivity, growth, intuition, confusion, or becoming do not have to be universally understood in order to be valid. That is a hard thing to hold on to if you have spent a long time needing external agreement before you trust yourself, especially if you were raised in environments where your experience was often denied, minimized, corrected, or talked over. In those environments, people often learn to second-guess themselves as a form of survival. They stop asking what is true for me and start asking what version of my truth will be easiest for others to accept. Over time, that can make a person feel deeply estranged from their own instincts. But healing often begins when you slowly stop requiring universal understanding before you let yourself be real. That does not mean you stop caring about connection. It just means you stop treating misunderstanding like a verdict. You stop making other people's confusion the judge of your reality. You stop needing everyone to nod before you allow yourself to say, "This matters to me, this affects me, this is not right for me, this is what I need, this is who I am becoming, this is what feels true." That kind of self-trust is not arrogance. It is emotional adulthood, because part of becoming more solid in yourself is accepting that some parts of your life will remain difficult for other people to fully grasp. Not because you are doing something wrong, but because no one else lives inside your exact nervous system, your exact history, your exact mind, your exact becoming. There will always be parts of your inner life that are simply yours to know more intimately than anyone else ever can. That is not a flaw in your existence. That is part of being a person. So maybe tonight, if your mind has been twisting itself trying to feel more explainable, more acceptable, more easily understood, maybe this is the gentlest truth to land inside. You do not need perfect translation in order to be real. You do not need everyone's agreement in order to trust your own experience. You do not need universal understanding before your pain, your growth, your limits, your truth, or your becoming gets to count. Some people will understand you deeply. Some will only understand pieces, and some will not understand at all. That may hurt sometimes, but it does not erase what is real in you, because your truth does not wait for consensus before it becomes true. And you do not need everyone to understand you in order to exist honestly inside your own life. There is a softer life waiting when you stop fighting yourself. A lot of people do not realize how exhausting their life has become because the exhaustion is not only coming from work or stress or responsibility. It is coming from the constant friction of being at war with themselves. And that war can be so quiet, so normalized, so woven into daily thought that it barely even registers anymore. It just sounds like the way you speak to yourself when you fall short. The way you tense up around your own needs. The way you argue with your feelings instead of listening to them. The way you treat rest like weakness, sensitivity like inconvenience, uncertainty like failure, slowness like shame, mistakes like proof, and healing like something you should have finished by now. On the surface, it can all look like self-discipline, high standards, ambition, resilience. But underneath, it often feels like a life lived under constant internal correction. And that kind of inner tension changes everything. It changes the way you wake up in the morning. It changes how safe your own mind feels to live inside. It changes how you move through relationships, how you respond to stress, how you interpret setbacks, how quickly you collapse when things go wrong. Because if every hard moment in life is immediately met by a harder voice inside you, then you are never just dealing with the original pain. You are also dealing with the pain of being your own least gentle place to land. That is a brutal way to carry life, and most people did not choose it on purpose. Usually, they learned it. Somewhere along the way, they absorbed the idea that being hard on themselves was what kept them from falling apart. That if they let up, they would become lazy, weak, selfish, undisciplined, too emotional, too indulgent, too soft to survive. So they built an inner system based on pressure: push harder, do more, feel less, be better, do not trust ease, do not trust softness, do not trust your own need for care unless it becomes impossible to ignore. And over time, they stop noticing how much of their suffering is not coming from life itself, but from the way they keep meeting life with resistance from the inside. That is what self-fighting looks like. It is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is simply never letting yourself be where you are without immediately trying to improve, fix, minimize, override, or judge it. You are tired, and instead of responding with care, you respond with criticism. You are hurt, and instead of responding with gentleness, you respond with embarrassment. You are confused, and instead of responding with patience, you respond with panic. You are healing slowly, and instead of responding with trust, you respond with frustration. You are overwhelmed, and instead of responding with support, you respond with shame. So now, every vulnerable part of your experience gets met by force. And when that happens long enough, even your own inner world stops feeling safe to return to. That is why so many people feel chronically tense, even when nothing obvious is wrong, because the nervous system can feel when it is not being met with compassion. It can feel when every emotion gets interrogated, when every need gets delayed, when every limit gets treated like failure, when every mistake gets turned into identity. It can feel when the person living inside the body is not a source of relief, but another source of pressure. That kind of self-relationship drains people in ways they do not always know how to name. And maybe that is why the idea of a softer life can feel so distant to some people. Not because softness is unavailable to them, but because they have spent so long believing it would be irresponsible to stop fighting themselves. They think if they stop attacking every flaw, every weakness, every messy feeling, they will somehow lose control of their life. But often the opposite is true. People do not usually become healthier by being in constant opposition to themselves. They become healthier when they stop wasting so much energy on internal warfare and start using that energy to actually care for what is hurting. That is where life begins to change. Not always in huge dramatic ways. Sometimes it changes the moment you stop treating your tiredness like laziness. Sometimes it changes when you stop trying to earn rest through collapse. Sometimes it changes when you stop calling yourself weak for being affected. Sometimes it changes when you stop making your healing prove itself every day. Sometimes it changes when you stop requiring perfection before you offer yourself peace. Those shifts can look small from the outside, but internally, they are enormous, because the second you stop making your own humanity the enemy, your whole system gets a little more room to breathe, and maybe that is what a softer life actually is. Not a perfect life. Not a painless life. Not a life where nothing difficult ever happens. A softer life is a life where difficulty is no longer made heavier by self-rejection. A life where your own mind is not constantly turning every wound into evidence against you. A life where your mistakes do not become your identity, your emotions do not become your shame, your needs do not become your burden, and your slower seasons do not become proof that you are failing. That kind of life is possible, but it usually begins in a place most people underestimate. It begins in the way you speak to yourself when no one else is around. Because the relationship you have with your own mind becomes the atmosphere your whole life is lived inside. And if that atmosphere is harsh, suspicious, punishing, and relentlessly disappointed in you, then even beautiful things will feel harder to receive. But if that atmosphere starts becoming more honest, more patient, more forgiving, more on your side, then even hard things begin to land differently. You start recovering faster, you start spiraling less, you start trusting yourself more, you start needing less performance to feel okay, you start feeling less afraid of your own emotions, you start becoming a place you can actually come home to. That is not weakness. That is the beginning of peace. So if you have been feeling unusually tired lately, unusually heavy, unusually far from the version of life you keep hoping will finally feel easier, maybe this is the truth worth falling asleep to tonight. The softness you want is probably not waiting on the other side of becoming more perfect. It may be waiting on the other side of becoming less cruel to yourself. Because there really is a softer life waiting, not when you finally fix everything, not when you become flawless, not when you force your way into worthiness, but when you stop treating yourself like someone you need to defeat in order to deserve peace. And maybe that is where rest can begin tonight. You are not broken for needing more time than others. There is a very particular kind of shame that can settle into a person when they start noticing that life seems to take them longer than it seems to take other people. Longer to heal, longer to decide, longer to recover, longer to trust, longer to move on, longer to process, longer to feel ready, longer to become okay again after something hurt. And at first, that difference might just feel frustrating. But if it goes on long enough, it can start feeling much more personal than that. It can start sounding like a verdict. Like maybe this is not just your pace, maybe this is proof that something is wrong with you. That thought hurts because it sneaks in through comparison, and comparison is one of the fastest ways to make a human life look defective when it is actually just unfolding honestly. You see someone else bounce back faster, someone else make a clean decision, someone else seem emotionally lighter, more decisive, less affected, less tangled, more resilient on the surface. And from there, it is so easy for your mind to start asking all the wrong questions. Why am I still here with this? Why is this taking me so long? Why does everyone else seem to move through life faster than I do? Why am I not over this yet? Why am I still carrying something that other people would have already figured out by now? And once those questions start circling, your own pace begins to feel less like a rhythm and more like an accusation. That is where a lot of unnecessary suffering gets created. Because now you are not only carrying the original thing that needed time. The grief, the confusion, the fear, the transition, the heartbreak, the healing, the uncertainty, the nervous system fatigue, the life chapter that did not unfold cleanly. Now you are also carrying shame about how long it is taking, and that extra layer can make everything feel heavier than it already was. You are not just healing, you are defending your healing. You are not just recovering, you are apologizing for your recovery. You are not just moving at your own speed, you are quietly judging yourself for not moving at someone else's. That is exhausting. And the tragedy is that so many people have been taught to interpret slowness as failure, when often it is simply evidence that something in them is being processed deeply instead of rushed past. That matters more than people think. Because there is a huge difference between getting over something quickly and actually integrating it honestly. There is a difference between moving on and merely moving away. There is a difference between appearing okay and becoming okay. But in a culture that worships speed, emotional efficiency can start looking like health even when it is actually just avoidance wearing nice clothes. So if you are the kind of person who takes your time, who needs more space to process, who does not snap back overnight, who cannot force yourself into closure just because the calendar says enough time has passed, it can be very easy to mistake your depth for dysfunction. But needing more time does not automatically mean something is wrong. Sometimes it means something in you is taking your life seriously. Sometimes it means your heart does not move at the same speed as your intellect. Sometimes it means your nervous system needs more safety before it can release what it has been holding. Sometimes it means your body is still trying to understand what your mind has already explained 100 times. And sometimes it simply means you are a human being, not a machine built to metabolize pain, change, loss, pressure, and transformation on command. That should not be a radical truth, but for a lot of people it is. Because they have spent years believing that the healthiest version of healing is the fastest one, the cleanest one, the one that looks least disruptive, the one that inconveniences the fewest people, the one that allows them to get back to performing normalcy as quickly as possible. But healing, grieving, deciding, recovering, rebuilding trust, changing old patterns, learning how to feel safe again, these things do not always happen on socially acceptable timelines, and trying to force them into one often creates more damage than the original pain ever did. That is what people miss. When you keep trying to rush yourself through something your system is not done with, you do not actually become free faster. You just become more divided. One part of you is still hurting, still processing, still asking for care, while another part is standing over it with a stopwatch, demanding that it be finished already. And when that split gets strong enough, your inner world starts feeling hostile. Not because you are broken, but because you are being denied the one thing healing often needs most. Time without shame. That changes everything. Because the moment you stop treating your own pace like a problem to solve, you create room for something gentler to happen. You stop making your slowness mean incapacity. You stop making your tenderness mean weakness. You stop using someone else's timeline as the ruler for whether your inner life is unfolding correctly. And that does not mean you stay stuck forever. It means you stop panicking every time your growth does not look efficient enough to impress people who are not living inside your actual nervous system. There is so much freedom in that, so much relief in finally understanding that some things take longer not because you are doing them badly, but because they are real. Real grief takes time. Real trust takes time. Real self-respect takes time. Real healing takes time. Real change takes time. Real becoming takes time. And if your life is asking more time of you right now than you wish it were, that does not automatically mean you are delayed, damaged, or incapable. It may simply mean you are in a season where your soul is refusing to be rushed. And honestly, that deserves more respect than shame, because a lot of people arrive quickly into versions of life they are not actually ready to inhabit. They force closure they do not feel. They force relationships they are not safe enough for. They force confidence that collapses under pressure. They force healing that was only surface deep. Speed can be seductive because it looks strong from the outside. But sometimes the stronger thing is to move honestly, even when honestly is slower. So if your mind has been turning your pace into a flaw lately, if you have been secretly embarrassed by how long certain things are taking, maybe this is the truth worth holding tonight. You are not late to your own becoming. You are not weak because your heart takes longer. You are not defective because your nervous system needs more care. You are not broken for needing more time than others. You are allowed to unfold at the speed your life actually requires. And there is nothing shameful about a healing process that refuses to lie just to look faster. Your body is trying to protect you, even when it feels inconvenient. It is a strange and lonely feeling when your own body starts seeming like the thing that is getting in the way of your life. When you are tired before you think you should be tired. When your chest tightens at the wrong time. When your stomach drops over something your mind is trying to dismiss. When your heart races during a conversation that should be simple. When your shoulders stay tense for no clear reason. When rest does not fully restore you and calm does not come as quickly as it seems to come for other people. In those moments, it can feel like your body is being dramatic, difficult, overreactive, inconvenient, like it is interrupting the version of you that just wants to function normally and get through the day without so much internal resistance. And when that keeps happening, a person can start becoming deeply frustrated with themselves, not because they want to hate their body, but because they are tired of feeling slowed down by something they cannot always explain, tired of feeling activated when they want to feel relaxed, tired of feeling drained when they want to feel capable, tired of carrying symptoms, sensations, heaviness, sensitivity, or fatigue that does not seem to make sense in proportion to what is happening around them. So they start trying to overpower it, ignore it, push through it, shame it into silence. They tell themselves to calm down, toughen up, get over it, stop being so affected, and for a while, that can create the illusion of control. But underneath, the body usually keeps speaking, because the body is not trying to ruin your life, it is trying to keep you alive. That is such an important shift in perspective, especially if you have spent years feeling betrayed by your own nervous system. What feels inconvenient is often protective. What feels irrational is often adaptive. What feels like overreaction is often a body that learned, at some point, that staying alert was safer than staying relaxed. And once the body learns that lesson deeply enough, it does not just drop it because your conscious mind would prefer a more convenient response now. That is what makes this so hard. Your mind can understand that you are safe while your body is still operating like it has reasons not to trust that yet. And when those two things are out of sync, people often assume the body is the problem, but usually the body is not malfunctioning. It is remembering, it is predicting, it is scanning. It is trying in its own imperfect and often exhausting way to prevent pain before it arrives. That is what a protective nervous system does. It watches for danger even when danger is no longer obvious. It braces before impact even when impact does not come. It sends tension, fatigue, nausea, shutdown, hypervigilance, restlessness, numbness, urgency, or overwhelm, not because it is trying to punish you, but because somewhere along the way, it learned that staying prepared increased your chances of making it through. And maybe it did. Maybe there were seasons of your life where disconnecting from your body was the only way you knew how to keep functioning. Maybe there were environments where you had to stay on edge to stay safe. Maybe there were experiences that taught your system not to relax too easily, not to trust too quickly, not to let down its guard without proof. Bodies remember those things even when the mind gets tired of revisiting them. That does not mean you are doomed to feel this way forever. But it does mean your body deserves more curiosity than contempt, because healing rarely begins through war. It usually begins when the part of you that wants to get rid of the symptoms starts understanding what the symptoms are trying to do for you. That changes the whole relationship. Instead of asking, "What is wrong with me?" you begin asking, "What is my body trying to protect me from right now?" Instead of saying, "Why can I not just be normal?" you begin noticing, "Maybe my system has been carrying more than I realized." Instead of treating your body like an enemy that keeps embarrassing you, you begin seeing it as a messenger that may be clumsy, loud, inconvenient, and exhausted, but still deeply on your side. That matters because the body responds differently to being listened to than it does to being attacked. A nervous system under chronic stress does not calm down because you yell at it harder. It does not feel safer because you shame it for reacting. It does not regulate because you compare it to people who seem less affected. Safety is not built through self-contempt. It is built through consistency, gentleness, repetition, and the slow reeducation of a system that learned to associate life with too much unpredictability for too long. That process can feel frustratingly slow, especially if you are someone who just wants to feel normal again. But even that desire often comes from a good place. You want ease. You want peace. You want to move through your own life without feeling like your body is constantly interrupting the experience. That longing makes sense. But the path there is usually not through more force. It is through more trust, and trust with your body is built in tiny ways, in resting before total collapse, in noticing tension before it becomes pain, in stepping away before overwhelm becomes shutdown, in feeding yourself before depletion becomes emotional chaos, in honoring a limit before your body has to scream it louder, in realizing that the fatigue, anxiety, sensitivity, or tension you feel may not be proof of weakness, but proof that your system has been working overtime for longer than anyone can see. That is not failure. That is effort. Invisible effort. And maybe tonight, if your body has been feeling especially inconvenient lately, especially heavy, especially reactive, especially hard to live inside, this is the truth worth hearing before sleep. Your body is not trying to sabotage you. It is trying to protect you with the tools it learned when protection felt necessary. It may not always know the difference yet between the past and the present. It may not always respond in ways that feel graceful or fair. It may ask for more rest, more slowness, more gentleness, more patience than your mind thinks should be necessary. But none of that means it is against you. It means it has been trying very hard to keep you here. And maybe the deepest healing begins not when you finally force your body to stop reacting, but when you stop treating its reactions like betrayal and start meeting them like messages from a part of you that has been working all along to keep you safe. You are still becoming, and that is a beautiful place to be. There is a very particular kind of sadness that can show up when you look at your life and realize you are not quite where you thought you would be by now, not fully who you imagined, not fully healed, not fully settled, not fully clear, not fully there. And even if things are not terrible, even if parts of your life are growing, even if you have come farther than you usually give yourself credit for, there can still be this quiet ache that lingers underneath it all. This sense that you are somehow suspended between versions of yourself, no longer who you were, but not yet fully rooted in who you are becoming either. That in-between space can feel so uncomfortable. Because human beings love completion. We love arrival. We love things that make sense in hindsight. We love the fantasy of becoming a finished version of ourselves that we can finally rest inside without so much uncertainty, contradiction, or unfolding. So when life keeps handing us these unfinished seasons, these transitional identities, these slow emotional renovations that do not yet have a neat before and after, it can be hard not to interpret that in-between state as a problem. As if still becoming means still lacking. As if being unfinished means being behind. But becoming is not a deficiency. It is the actual condition of being alive. And maybe that sounds obvious on paper, but emotionally, so many people still treat their own unfolding like evidence that they are not enough yet. They think they have to reach some future version of themselves before they are allowed to feel peace, pride, belonging, softness, or relief. Once I heal more, once I am clearer, once I am more disciplined, once I stop struggling with this, once I finally become the person I am supposed to be, then I will let myself exhale. But that kind of thinking can quietly steal whole years from a person's life because it turns the present into a waiting room for worthiness. It makes every unfinished part of you feel like a delay instead of a living process. And the truth is, most of your life will not be spent as a completed masterpiece standing at some final point of self-realization. Most of your life will be lived in motion, in layers, in seasons, in the strange, tender, unfinished reality of learning who you are while still being who you are at the same time. That is not failure. That is what growth actually feels like. It is rarely neat. It is often contradictory. You can be wiser and still confused, more healed and still tender, more self-aware and still struggling. more grounded and still grieving, more whole and still in process. That does not mean your becoming is fake, it means it is real. Because real growth does not erase your humanity, it deepens your relationship to it. It makes you more honest, not more polished, more rooted, not more perfect, more able to hold complexity without turning it into shame. And maybe that is what makes becoming so difficult for people. It asks you to live without the comfort of total resolution. It asks you to trust a version of yourself that is still unfolding. It asks you to honor progress that is not always visible, identity that is still forming, clarity that is still arriving, healing that is still in motion. It asks you to stop demanding that your life be fully formed before you are willing to call it meaningful. That is hard. Especially if you are tired. Especially if you have spent years trying to arrive somewhere emotionally solid enough to finally feel safe. Especially if part of you still believes that becoming should have been over by now. But there is something deeply human and honestly very beautiful about not being finished. Because it means life is still happening inside you. It means your story is still moving. It means there are parts of you still waking up, still softening, still clarifying, still being shaped by truth, still learning how to love more honestly, rest more deeply, choose more wisely, and return to yourself more gently. That is not emptiness. That is aliveness. And yes, being in process can feel vulnerable. It can feel messy to not have all the answers. It can feel frustrating to still be untangling things you thought you would have figured out by now. It can feel disorienting to outgrow one version of yourself without fully knowing what the next one will look like. But uncertainty is not always a sign that you are lost. Sometimes it is simply what it feels like to be in the middle of becoming someone more true. That kind of transformation rarely announces itself with certainty first. Usually it begins as discomfort, a restlessness, a sense that your old ways no longer fit, a quiet pull toward a softer, truer, more honest life, even if you cannot fully describe it yet. And when that happens, the mind often panics because it wants immediate clarity. It wants guarantees. It wants a map. But the soul does not always work like that. Sometimes it reveals itself gradually, in layers, in glimpses, in small acts of self-respect, in new boundaries, in old patterns losing their grip, in the subtle but undeniable feeling that something in you is changing, even if you do not have the language for all of it yet. That deserves trust. Not because the path is fully clear, but because becoming has never required total certainty in order to be real. So maybe tonight, if you have been feeling unsettled by how unfinished your life still feels, how in between your identity still feels, how much of yourself still seems to be under construction, maybe this is the truth worth resting inside. You do not need to be complete in order to be worthy of this moment. You do not need to have fully arrived in order to be living something meaningful. You do not need to be done becoming in order to be enough tonight. There is nothing shameful about still unfolding, nothing lesser about still learning, nothing wrong with being in process. Because the version of you that is still becoming is not a temporary inconvenience on the way to your real life. That is your real life, and if you can stop treating your unfinishedness like a flaw, you may begin to see what has been true all along. You are still becoming. And that is a beautiful place to be. Peace can exist even before everything is figured out. A lot of people have unknowingly made a private deal with themselves that sounds something like this. I will relax when I understand everything. I will rest when I have solved enough. I will feel safe when there are no loose ends left, no unanswered questions, no uncertainty, no emotional mess, no unresolved future hanging over me. And until then, I stay mentally on duty. I keep scanning. I keep analyzing. I keep rehearsing possibilities and preparing for outcomes and trying to think my way into a version of life that feels fully secured against surprise. The problem is, that version of life never really arrives. Not in the clean way the anxious mind keeps promising it will. Because life does not become peaceful by first becoming completely predictable. Human existence simply does not work like that. There will almost always be something unfinished, something unclear, something waiting on time, something you cannot force into certainty tonight no matter how hard your mind keeps circling it. A conversation you have not had yet, a decision you are not ready to make yet, a future you cannot fully see yet, a part of yourself still healing, a relationship still unresolved, a season still in motion. Some form of incompleteness is almost always present somewhere, and if your nervous system has decided peace can only happen after all of that disappears, then peace keeps getting pushed farther and farther away. That is why so many people feel chronically restless even when they are technically safe. Their body is in bed, but their mind is still trying to close every open loop before sleep, still trying to finish life before allowing softness, still trying to solve tomorrow from inside tonight. And because that work is impossible, the system stays activated. Not because you are doing something wrong, but because you have accidentally trained yourself to believe that uncertainty and peace cannot coexist. But they can, and honestly, they have to. Because if peace only arrives once life is fully figured out, then almost nobody gets to experience it for very long. That is the hard truth people rarely say out loud. A lot of the peace people are searching for is not actually hiding behind perfect clarity. It is hiding behind their refusal to let uncertainty exist without turning it into an emergency. That changes everything. Because now the question is not, how do I make life completely certain before I can rest? The real question becomes, how do I stop treating every unknown like a threat I have to mentally control in order to survive? That is a much deeper shift, and it matters because the human mind is incredibly persuasive when it is scared. It will tell you that your tension is responsibility, that your overthinking is preparation, that your inability to relax is proof you are taking life seriously. But a lot of the time, what feels like responsibility is actually resistance. It is the mind trying to negotiate with uncertainty by staying hyper-engaged with it. If I think enough, maybe I can prevent pain. If I rehearse enough, maybe I can avoid surprise. If I stay mentally close enough to the problem, maybe I will feel safer. But most of the time, that does not create safety. It creates exhaustion, because some things in life cannot be solved by more thinking. Some things need time. Some need perspective. Some need distance. Some need a future version of you that does not exist yet tonight, and trying to force resolution too early can make the mind feel busier without making the heart feel any more settled. That is where people start confusing mental activity with emotional progress. Just because you are thinking about something constantly does not mean you are actually moving it forward. Sometimes you are just staying entangled with it. And if your mind has been doing that lately, if it has been trying to earn peace by solving, controlling, predicting, or mentally finishing every unfinished thing before it lets you exhale, maybe this is what it needs to hear. Not everything unresolved is urgent. Not everything unknown is dangerous. Not every open loop has to be closed tonight in order for your body to deserve rest. That is not avoidance. That is wisdom. Because wisdom knows the difference between what needs your attention now and what is simply asking for trust. And trust can feel terrifying if you are used to gripping life tightly in order to feel safe. But peace almost always requires some form of release. Not because everything is handled, but because your system finally understands that it does not have to stay in a constant state of negotiation with reality in order to survive it. That is such a gentler way to live, a life where peace is not postponed until every answer arrives. A life where your mind is not always trying to outwork uncertainty. A life where unresolved things are allowed to remain unresolved for a while without stealing your entire nervous system. That kind of peace is quieter than control. It does not feel like certainty. It feels like enough safety in the present moment to stop chasing certainty, as if it is the only thing that can soothe you. And maybe you have already felt glimpses of that before without fully naming it. The strange relief of realizing something can remain unfinished and still not destroy your whole night. The calm that comes when you stop trying to emotionally solve a future that has not happened yet. The softness that appears when you finally admit that no amount of midnight thinking is going to produce the exact answer your nervous system wants right now. That softness matters, because it is not passive, it is not giving up, it is not pretending things do not matter. It is choosing not to let every unresolved part of life become a hostage situation inside your body. That is a different kind of strength than most people are taught. And maybe that is exactly why it feels so healing. So, if your mind has been trying to keep you awake with unfinished things, uncertain things, things you wish you could know, fix, decide, guarantee, or control before morning, maybe let this truth land instead. Peace does not always come from finally figuring everything out. Sometimes it comes from no longer requiring complete clarity before you let yourself be here, before you let yourself breathe, before you let yourself soften, before you let tonight just be tonight, because your life does not have to become fully solved before your nervous system is allowed a moment of rest. Some things can stay unanswered for now. Some things can stay in progress. Some things can belong to tomorrow. And even with all of that still unfinished, peace can still exist here. Not later, not after every answer, even now. You are allowed to be proud of how quietly you kept going. There are forms of strength that almost never get recognized properly because they do not look dramatic enough from the outside. They do not come with applause, milestones, or obvious turning points. They do not create the kind of story people know how to celebrate. They are quiet, repetitive, private, easy to overlook, especially by the person who had to live them. And one of the most painful things about surviving a difficult season is that once you make it through enough of it, your mind often stops seeing what it took. It starts focusing only on what is still unfinished, what still hurts, what still is not where you want it to be. Meanwhile, a whole history of invisible effort gets erased in the background like it never counted simply because it was not loud enough to be witnessed. That happens to so many people without them realizing it. They keep moving, keep handling things, keep getting through days that are emotionally heavier than anyone around them fully understands, and because they did not collapse publicly, because they still showed up, because they still answered messages, still got out of bed, still did what needed to be done, it starts to look ordinary even to them. But what looks ordinary from the outside can actually be the result of enormous inner effort. Sometimes the strongest thing a person has done all year is something no one would ever think to praise. Getting through a week without giving up. Holding themselves together in a room where they wanted to disappear. Continuing to function while carrying grief, confusion, heartbreak, burnout, anxiety, loneliness, disappointment, or exhaustion that never had a clean place to go. And because none of that is flashy, people often do not know they are allowed to feel proud of it. That is the part that gets lost. Pride is usually reserved for visible achievement. For winning, finishing, accomplishing, proving, overcoming in ways that can be measured and shown. But a huge amount of human courage never becomes visible enough to fit inside those categories. A huge amount of real strength happens in the background of ordinary-looking days, in the discipline it takes to keep going when your emotions are heavy, in the restraint it takes not to return to old patterns that would have made the pain louder, in the patience it takes to survive a season that is not ending as quickly as you hoped it would, in the self-control it takes to keep showing up gently when a harsher version of you would have been easier to become. That kind of effort deserves more respect than most people ever give it. Because quiet perseverance is still perseverance. Private resilience is still resilience. The fact that no one fully saw what it took from you does not make it less real. If anything, it often means it took more. There is something uniquely exhausting about carrying hard things without much external acknowledgement. About having to keep living your life while your internal world is asking for far more care than anyone can see. About continuing to function while parts of you are still healing, still grieving, still adapting, still trying to make sense of what life has asked from you lately. And if you have been in one of those seasons, then there is a good chance your mind has not been very fair to you. It has probably kept moving the finish line, kept saying yes, but you should be farther by now. Yes, but you are still struggling with this. Yes, but you have not fully figured it out yet. Yes, but you are still tired, still tender, still not where you thought you would be. And that mindset is so brutal because it makes it nearly impossible to honor the effort you have already spent. It trains you to only recognize yourself once the whole story is over and polished, once the healing is complete, once the struggle has been translated into something inspiring and easy to summarize. But most of life is not lived in those polished after moments. Most of life is lived in the middle, in the not yet, in the still trying, in the carrying on before the meaning has fully arrived. And that is exactly why this matters so much. Because if you only allow yourself pride after everything is resolved, you will miss the dignity of who you have already been in the unresolved parts. You will miss the version of you that kept going without certainty, without closure, without much external reward, and often without even feeling particularly strong while doing it. That version of you deserves to be seen too. Not just the future healed version. Not just the one who eventually tells the story better. The one who was in the middle of it and still kept showing up. That is not nothing. That is character. That is endurance. That is a form of beauty people overlook because it is not loud enough for the world's attention span. And maybe tonight, that is what needs to land, that the fact you kept going quietly does not make it less impressive. It may actually make it more sacred. Because anyone can look brave when there is an audience, when there is momentum, when there is visible proof that the effort is paying off. But to keep going when the progress is slow, when the healing is private, when the days blur together, when there is no applause, no certainty, no dramatic evidence that it is all leading somewhere, that requires something much deeper than performance. It requires a kind of inner loyalty to your own life that is easy to underestimate while you are living it, and maybe you have had more of that than you realize. Maybe there were nights you made it through that no one knows about. Maybe there were choices you resisted that no one will ever applaud. Maybe there were mornings you got up carrying things that should have flattened you and somehow still moved through the day. Maybe there were versions of pain you learned to live beside without letting them define your entire future. Maybe there were moments when simply staying was the bravest thing available to you. If that is true, then yes, you are allowed to be proud, not in a performative way, not in a loud self-congratulatory way, but in a deeply human way, in the kind of way that says, I know what this took from me, and I also know what it took for me to remain here. That kind of pride is not ego. It is self-witnessing. It is the refusal to let your own quiet courage go completely unnoticed just because the world did not stop to name it for you. So if your mind has been minimizing your effort lately, if it has been acting like the only things that count are the visible wins, the obvious breakthroughs, the dramatic transformations, maybe let this truth settle in instead. You do not need a perfect ending before your strength gets to count. You do not need a dramatic comeback before your effort becomes meaningful. You do not need an audience before your resilience becomes real. You are allowed to be proud of how quietly you kept going. Because some of the most extraordinary things a person will ever do in this life are so quiet that almost no one notices them while they are happening, but they still matter, and so do you. Some of your best qualities appear when no one applauds them. A lot of people have accidentally trained themselves to only notice the parts of who they are that get reflected back to them, the parts that get praised, rewarded, admired, needed, or recognized, the useful parts, the impressive parts, the visible parts. And because of that, they can go years without fully understanding the deeper truth of themselves. Not because they do not have depth, but because so much of what is most beautiful about a person often shows up in places that are too quiet to be celebrated properly. That is one of the strangest things about being human. Some of your most meaningful qualities will never arrive in a form that gets obvious applause. They will not always make you more admired. They will not always make you more successful. They will not always produce immediate proof that they matter. In fact, some of the best things about you may live almost entirely in moments no one else fully sees. That can be hard to believe in a world that teaches people to measure value through visibility. Because once you get used to external reinforcement, it becomes easy to assume that what gets noticed is what matters most. So naturally, your mind starts tracking the visible stuff: achievement, productivity, charisma, performance, likability, talent, attention, approval. Those things are not meaningless, but they are incomplete. They can tell you something about how you are received, but they do not always tell you the truest things about who you are when no one is looking. And often, the quietest parts of you are the most revealing. The way you speak to yourself when you are disappointed. The way you treat people when there is nothing to gain. The way you hold back cruelty when life gives you a reason to become harsh. The way you keep your word in small moments that no one would ever think to reward. The way you stay thoughtful when rushing would be easier. The way you choose honesty in places where performance would be more convenient. The way you continue trying, caring, softening, learning, and showing restraint in moments that never become visible enough to count in the eyes of the world. That is where so much real character lives. And the sad thing is, people often miss it in themselves because it does not look dramatic enough. It does not come with comments, trophies, promotions, praise, or obvious milestones. It often just looks like being decent in private, being gentle when no one asked you to be, staying ethical when it would be easier not to, remaining kind in ways no one will ever trace back to your effort, continuing to care even when your caring is not being mirrored or rewarded. That kind of goodness can feel invisible, but invisible is not the same thing as unimportant. In fact, some of the most trustworthy parts of a person are the parts that only show up when there is no reward attached. That is where motive gets honest. That is where identity becomes more real than image. That is where you find out what actually lives in you when the social performance falls away. And maybe that is worth sitting with for a second, because a lot of people are secretly afraid that if no one is affirming them, then maybe they are not becoming much at all. Maybe they are not doing enough. Maybe they are not enough. But that fear often comes from having a very narrow relationship to value. A relationship that says if it is not being noticed, it must not be real enough to count. But life is full of things that matter deeply without announcing themselves. Roots grow underground. Healing happens in silence. Trust gets built in tiny repeated moments. Character forms in decisions no one claps for. And some of the strongest, kindest, wisest, most beautiful parts of you may be developing right now in ways that are too subtle for the outside world to properly reward. That does not make them smaller. It may actually make them purer. Because applause can be confusing. It can make people shape themselves around what gets rewarded instead of what feels true. It can make them perform goodness instead of becoming it. It can make them chase admiration in ways that slowly pull them away from their actual center. So sometimes, the quiet places in life are not punishments. Sometimes they are the only environments where certain qualities can grow honestly, without being distorted by the need to be seen. That matters if you are in a season right now where life feels a little invisible, where your effort is private, where your growth is not especially glamorous, where your kindness, discipline, tenderness, honesty, patience, or emotional labor is not being recognized in any obvious way, because it is easy in those seasons to start feeling overlooked by your own life, to start wondering whether anything meaningful is happening at all. But maybe more is being formed in you than your current circumstances are capable of reflecting back. Maybe your patience is deepening. Maybe your integrity is strengthening. Maybe your compassion is becoming more rooted. Maybe your ability to stay soft without becoming weak is becoming one of the strongest things about you. Maybe your restraint, your thoughtfulness, your quiet consistency, your care, your emotional honesty, your ability to keep choosing decency in private, maybe all of that is shaping a life far more beautiful than applause could ever fully measure. That deserves to be remembered, especially at night, especially in the quiet, especially when your mind starts trying to reduce your worth to what was publicly affirmed today. Because not everything meaningful about you will be visible on demand. Not every beautiful quality you carry will be easy to point at. Not every good thing in you will be mirrored back quickly enough to reassure your fear. But that does not mean it is not there, and maybe that is one of the most comforting truths of all, that the best parts of you are not always the loudest ones. Not always the ones that impress people first. Not always the ones that create instant reaction. Sometimes the best parts of you are the ones that keep showing up quietly, steadily, faithfully, in rooms where no one is watching closely enough to call them extraordinary. And still, they are. So if tonight feels quiet, if your mind is measuring your value through what was noticed, praised, rewarded, or applauded, maybe let this truth settle in instead. Some of your best qualities were never meant to depend on applause in order to be real. Some of your deepest beauty exists in the unwitnessed parts of your life, and some of the truest things about who you are only appear fully when no one is around to turn them into performance. That does not make them less valuable. It makes them part of the most real version of you. You do not need to be perfect to be deeply lovable. One of the most exhausting things a person can quietly carry is the belief that love becomes safer the more flawless they can make themselves. Not perfect in some obvious, unrealistic, movie kind of way, but perfect in all the smaller, more believable ways people actually chase every day. More emotionally controlled, more attractive, more successful, more easy to understand, less needy, less complicated, less sensitive, less messy, less affected, more healed, more useful, more impressive, more self-contained, more whatever it is they secretly believe would finally make them secure enough to be loved without fear. And if that belief has lived in you for a long time, it can start shaping your whole relationship to intimacy without you even noticing. You do not just want to be loved, you want to become lovable enough that love will no longer feel risky. You want to eliminate the parts of yourself that seem rejectable. You want to become so emotionally manageable, so self-aware, so put together, so hard to leave, so easy to keep, that nobody could reasonably choose distance from you once they really know you. And on the surface, that can look like self-improvement. But underneath, it is often fear wearing a very disciplined face, because perfectionism is rarely just about standards. A lot of the time, it is about protection. It is the mind's way of saying, if I can just refine myself enough, maybe I can finally avoid the pain of not being chosen, not being understood, not being enough for someone, not being handled carefully, not being loved in the places where I still feel unfinished. That is such a tender human fear, and it makes sense. Because most people have had moments in life where their imperfections did feel costly. Maybe your emotions were too much for someone. Maybe your needs were met with distance. Maybe your messiness made someone impatient. Maybe your healing was slower than someone knew how to hold. Maybe your tenderness was mishandled. Maybe your humanity got mirrored back to you as inconvenience, and now some part of you believes love would be safer if you could just become easier to love. But that belief can become a prison, because once love gets tied to perfection, you stop relating as a real person and start relating as a project. You begin managing yourself instead of revealing yourself. You begin curating instead of connecting. You begin constantly monitoring whether you are too much, too emotional, too flawed, too needy, too uncertain, too unpolished to remain lovable. And even when someone does care about you, it can still feel hard to trust because deep down you are still trying to earn safety through performance. That is the tragedy of it. Perfectionism promises security, but it often creates distance, because you cannot be deeply loved if you are never deeply seen, and you cannot be deeply seen if you are always busy editing the parts of yourself you think might disqualify you from being loved. That is why so many people feel lonely even inside connection. Not because nobody cares, but because they are relating through a version of themselves that is constantly trying to stay acceptable instead of fully real. They are offering a polished survival self, and then wondering why love still feels fragile. But fragile is exactly how it will feel if your nervous system believes the love depends on how well you maintain the performance. That is no way to rest inside love, and maybe that is what your heart needs to hear tonight. That deep love was never supposed to require the elimination of your humanity, not your sensitivity, not your needs, not your healing process, not your limits, not your complicated feelings, not your slower seasons, not your tenderness, not your unfinished parts, not your mistakes, not your becoming. Because being deeply lovable does not mean being endlessly polished. It means being real enough to be met. That is a very different thing. And yes, real love does not mean every person will know how to hold every part of you perfectly. Some people will still misunderstand you. Some will still lack the capacity. Some will still only know how to love the easier versions of you. That part is painful, but it is not proof that you should have become more perfect. It is often just proof that not every connection has the depth, maturity, or emotional range to meet you fully. Those are different truths, and confusing them can cost people years. Because if you interpret every painful experience in love as evidence that you should have been less flawed, more polished, more emotionally convenient, then you will keep trying to solve heartbreak by becoming less human. But the answer was never to become less human. It was to stop making your humanity the enemy. That changes the whole emotional equation. You stop asking, how do I become impossible to reject? And you start asking, how do I stop abandoning myself in the pursuit of being chosen? That is where real peace begins, because love that only feels available to the perfected version of you will always feel unstable. But love that can hold your truth, your limits, your tenderness, your uncertainty, your slower seasons, your very human edges, that is the kind of love your nervous system can actually rest inside. And maybe before anyone else can fully hold that truth with you, your own mind needs to stop arguing with it first. Your worth is not postponed until your flaws disappear. Your lovability is not waiting on the other side of total self-mastery. You do not need to become easier, quieter, cleaner, prettier, wiser, less emotional, less needy, less complicated, or more perfect in order to deserve deep care. You are already someone a healthy kind of love could meet here, not later, not after enough self-improvement, here, as you are. Still growing, yes, still healing, yes, still imperfect, yes, and still deeply lovable. That is not a comforting fantasy. That is one of the most important truths a person can learn if they ever want to stop turning love into something they have to audition for. So if your heart has been tired lately, if part of you still believes you need to become better before you can finally feel safe being loved, maybe let this truth settle into the quieter parts of you tonight. You do not have to earn tenderness by becoming flawless. You do not have to deserve love by becoming less real. You do not have to perfect yourself into being worthy of care, because the deepest kinds of love were never built for perfection in the first place. They were built for truth. And truth includes your humanity too. The parts of you hide may also be the parts most worthy of tenderness. There are parts of almost every person that learned at some point to go underground. Not because they were bad, not because they were unlovable in any objective sense, but because somewhere along the way, they became associated with risk. Maybe it was your sadness. Maybe it was your anger. Maybe it was how deeply you feel, how easily you get overwhelmed, how much reassurance you need, how sensitive you are to rejection, how slowly you heal, how intensely you love, how unsure you sometimes feel, how much you care, how hard certain things hit you, how human you are in ways that do not always look polished or easy. Whatever it was, something in you learned that showing those parts came with a cost. So naturally, you adapted. You tucked them away. You softened them, edited them, disguised them, intellectualized them, laughed them off, outgrew them on the surface, or built a more acceptable version of yourself to stand in front of them. And if you have been doing that for long enough, it can start to feel so normal that you no longer even register it as hiding. It just feels like being functional, being mature, being self-aware, being chill, being independent, being low maintenance, being the kind of person who does not need too much and does not show too much and does not let too much slip through. But under that polished version of control, there is often a much more vulnerable truth. There are still parts of you quietly waiting in the dark, not because they are dangerous, but because they never fully learned that being seen would be safe. That is where so much loneliness comes from. Not just from being alone, but from being loved only in the places where you feel edited. From being understood only in the parts you know how to present neatly. From being accepted in ways that still leave your deeper, softer, messier, more tender truths untouched and unheld. That kind of loneliness can exist even in close relationships, even in families, even in friendships, even in rooms where people technically know you. Because being around people is not the same thing as feeling safe enough to stop hiding. And if some part of you still believes that your most tender places are the exact places that would make you harder to love, then of course you keep them hidden. That is not weakness, that is protection. But what hurts is that the very parts you keep protecting through concealment are often the exact parts that ache most for gentleness. That is the cruel paradox. The places in you that feel the most embarrassing are often the places that were simply never held properly. The parts that feel too much are often the parts that once carried too much alone. The needs you judge most harshly are often the needs that went unmet for so long they started feeling shameful. The emotions you try hardest to control are often the ones that never got to be met with enough patience to feel safe in the first place. That changes the whole way you look at yourself, because now those hidden parts are no longer evidence of something defective in you. They start looking more like younger truths that adapted to survive environments that did not know how to honor them well. And maybe that is one of the deepest forms of healing there is. Not getting rid of those parts. Not finally becoming too evolved to have them. But learning how to approach them differently. Learning how to stop meeting them with the same rejection that made them hide in the first place. That is not easy. Because for a lot of people, self-rejection became a form of emotional self-management. If they could shame the softer parts first, maybe no one else would get the chance to. If they could dismiss their own neediness, their own insecurity, their own sensitivity, their own fear, their own longing, maybe it would hurt less if someone else did too. So they became fluent in preemptive self-abandonment. They learned how to exile themselves before anyone else could. But all that really does is deepen the split. Now the hidden parts are not only carrying their original wound, they are also carrying your current judgment of them. That is why they still feel so raw. Because they are not just unseen. They are often still being internally punished for existing at all, and maybe tonight this is what needs to soften. Not because every hidden part of you needs to be exposed to the whole world, and not because everyone automatically deserves access to your most vulnerable truths, but because you deserve to stop treating those truths like they are shameful just because they are tender. You deserve to stop assuming that the places you hide are the places least worthy of love. Sometimes the exact opposite is true. Sometimes the parts of you hide are the most innocent, the most misunderstood, the most exhausted, the most deserving of softness, the most in need of someone, even if that someone is first just you finally saying, "I see why you learned to stay hidden, and I am not going to punish you for it anymore." That kind of inner tenderness changes people, because once a hidden part stops expecting rejection, it can finally begin to unclench. It can begin to feel less like a secret flaw and more like a human place inside you that was always asking for gentleness, not shame. And maybe that is what your heart needs to hear before sleep tonight, that your hiddenness is not always proof of ugliness. Sometimes it is proof of tenderness that has not felt safe enough to come into the light. And tenderness is not something to be ashamed of. It is often the most sacred thing about a person. So if there are parts of you still keep tucked away, the needy parts, the emotional parts, the insecure parts, the grieving parts, the sensitive parts, the uncertain parts, the younger parts, the parts that still ache in ways you do not always know how to explain, maybe they do not need more fixing tonight. Maybe they need less judgment, less exile, less internal harshness. Maybe they need to be looked at with the kind of softness they should have received long ago. Because the parts of you hide are not automatically the parts that make you less lovable. They may actually be the parts most worthy of tenderness. You are more than the voice in your head that judges you. There is a voice most people know so well that they stop questioning its authority. It has been there for years, maybe for as long as they can remember, commenting on everything. The way they look, the way they speak, the way they handled that conversation. The thing they should have said differently. The thing they should have figured out by now. The emotion they should be over already. The habit they should have fixed. The life they should have built better. The version of themselves they should have become by now if they were really doing okay. It can sound rational, it can sound protective, it can even sound responsible. But underneath all of that, it is often just deeply practiced judgment wearing the mask of truth. And because that voice is so familiar, people start mistaking it for themselves. That is where a lot of suffering gets quietly rooted. Because once you start believing that every harsh thought in your head is an accurate reflection of who you are, your inner world becomes a very difficult place to live. You stop hearing the voice as one part of your experience and start hearing it as the final authority on your worth, your progress, your lovability, your intelligence, your emotional maturity, your future. It stops being commentary and starts becoming identity. Not I am having a judgmental thought, but this is the truth about me. That shift is so subtle and so damaging. Because the judging voice is rarely interested in helping you understand yourself more deeply. It is usually interested in control, in correction, in preventing vulnerability by staying ahead of it. It thinks if it can criticize you first, hard enough and early enough, maybe it can protect you from disappointment, rejection, embarrassment, failure, or pain. It thinks pressure is safety. It thinks self-attack is preparation. It thinks if it keeps you constantly aware of your flaws, you will somehow become less likely to get hurt by life. But most of the time, that is not what happens. Most of the time, you just become exhausted. You become hesitant around your own humanity. You become scared of your own imperfections. You become disconnected from the softer, wiser parts of yourself because the louder judging part keeps taking up all the oxygen in the room. And then one day, you realize you have been living as if your harshest internal narrator is the most trustworthy thing inside you. That is such a lonely way to exist, because the judging voice is often incredibly selective in what it notices. It tracks your mistakes with microscopic precision while ignoring your effort. It remembers your awkward moments but forgets your tenderness. It magnifies your failures and shrinks your growth. It acts as if your worst thoughts, weakest moments, and most uncertain seasons are the most accurate summary of your entire existence. And if you listen to it long enough without questioning it, you can start feeling like a distorted version of yourself even in moments when you are actually doing your best. That is why this matters so much, because you are not obligated to keep confusing the loudest voice in your head with the deepest truth about who you are. Those are not the same thing. The mind produces all kinds of thoughts, especially under stress, shame, fear, fatigue, comparison, or old emotional conditioning. It can replay inherited criticism like it is your own. It can recycle old wounds and present them as current facts. It can interpret uncertainty as failure and tenderness as weakness. It can be deeply unkind while sounding weirdly convincing. But believable does not always mean true. Familiar does not always mean wise. And internal does not automatically mean accurate. That is such an important thing to remember when the voice in your head has become especially loud. Because maybe it is not actually telling the truth. Maybe it is repeating fear. Maybe it is replaying survival strategies. Maybe it is echoing the tone of people who did not know how to love you gently. Maybe it is trying to control your life through shame because shame was once mistaken for safety. Maybe it is just tired, threatened, overworked, and clinging to old methods that no longer deserve unquestioned power over your self-image. That does not mean you have to hate that voice. It usually developed for a reason. At some point, it probably thought it was helping. At some point, staying hypercritical may have felt like the only way to stay acceptable, prepared, protected, or in control. But what once helped you survive is not always what helps you live well now. And part of growing emotionally is learning how to separate yourself from the internal narrator that has been judging you for years, not by pretending it is not there, not by forcing positivity over it, but by learning to hear it without handing it the microphone every single time. That is where freedom begins, in the quiet recognition that there is more in you than the part that criticizes. There is also the part that notices beauty, the part that wants peace, the part that still hopes, the part that keeps trying, the part that knows when something hurts, the part that longs for honesty instead of performance, the part that softens when given the chance, the part that sees nuance where the judging voice sees only verdicts, the part that is capable of tenderness, even if it has not had much practice yet. That part is you too, and maybe more truly you than the one that keeps trying to reduce your entire existence to a running list of flaws and unfinished business. So maybe tonight, if your mind has been especially sharp lately, especially relentless, especially convinced that its harshness is somehow the clearest picture of reality, maybe this is the truth worth falling asleep to instead. You are not every cruel thought that passes through your mind. You are not the voice that only knows how to measure, compare, criticize, and condemn. You are not the running commentary of your fear. You are not the internal pressure system that thinks shame is the same thing as growth. You are more than that, more than the judgments, more than the old scripts, more than the self-surveillance, more than the inherited harshness that still tries to call itself truth. And the more you remember that, the more space you create for a different kind of inner life, one where the voice in your head is no longer the ruler of your worth, one where you get to exist as a full human being instead of a constant self-correction project, one where your mind slowly becomes less like a courtroom and more like a place you can actually rest inside. Because you are more than the voice in your head that judges you, and that voice does not get to define the whole of you tonight. There is nothing wrong with being someone who feels deeply. There is a very specific kind of loneliness that comes from living in a world that often rewards emotional distance more than emotional depth. If you are someone who feels things deeply, not just sadness but beauty, disappointment, longing, tenderness, rejection, joy, tension, memory, silence, atmosphere, all of it, then there is a good chance you have spent at least part of your life wondering if something about you is too much for the pace and tone of the world around you. Not because anyone always says it directly, although sometimes they do, but because you start noticing how often depth gets translated into difficulty, how often tenderness gets mistaken for fragility, how often being affected gets treated like weakness, how often needing time, space, softness, reassurance, or emotional honesty gets subtly framed as something you should have grown out of by now. And if you hear those messages long enough, they can begin to shape the way you relate to your own nature. You start trying to edit yourself before anyone else can. You start muting your reactions. You start downplaying what hurts. You start apologizing for needing more time to process. You start acting less impacted than you really are. You start trying to become easier to handle, easier to explain, easier to be around. And eventually, you may become so practiced at managing your depth that you stop remembering it was never the problem in the first place. That is the heartbreaking part, because being someone who feels deeply can absolutely be hard. It can make life more intense, more vulnerable, more overstimulating, more emotionally expensive at times. It can mean you do not bounce back as quickly. It can mean words stay with you longer. It can mean endings echo. It can mean your body absorbs more than you wish it did. It can mean beauty moves you and loss undoes you, and small shifts in tone affect you more than other people seem to understand. But difficult is not the same thing as wrong. That distinction matters, because a lot of sensitive people have spent years confusing inconvenience with defect. Just because your depth has made certain parts of life harder does not mean it is evidence that you were built incorrectly. It may simply mean you are carrying a wider range of human experience than some people know how to respect. And honestly, the world often does not know what to do with people who feel deeply unless that depth can be turned into something useful, artistic, nurturing, or easy to admire from a distance. People love sensitivity when it looks poetic. They love it when it creates beauty, empathy, insight, creativity, care. But they often become much less comfortable with it when it asks for accommodation, when it needs rest, when it requires slowness, when it gets overwhelmed, when it does not package itself in a graceful way, when it cannot just be a gift to others and instead needs gentleness in return. That is where many deeply feeling people start learning the wrong lesson. They learn that their depth is acceptable only when it is beautiful for someone else, not when it is messy for them, not when it is heavy, not when it is inconvenient, not when it needs something back. So they start trying to keep only the elegant parts of their sensitivity and exile the rest. The tears, the fear, the overstimulation, the need for quiet, the emotional hangovers, the difficulty letting go, the way their nervous system takes longer to settle after being hurt. They try to keep the empathy and get rid of the ache, the tenderness and not the tenderness toward themselves, the insight and not the exhaustion. But that split rarely works for long, because depth is not something you can selectively amputate without also dulling parts of what makes you beautifully alive. The same heart that feels hurt deeply often loves deeply. The same nervous system that gets overwhelmed may also notice things other people miss. The same sensitivity that makes life more intense may also make it more meaningful. The same softness that has made you feel vulnerable may also be the reason you still know how to care in a world that keeps trying to harden people. That is not a flaw. That is a form of aliveness that deserves more reverence than shame. And yes, it may mean your life requires different things than someone else's. More recovery, more boundaries, more honesty, more rest, more care around what and who you let into your system. But needing those things does not mean your emotional makeup is defective. It means your system has its own language, its own pace, its own thresholds. And if you stop trying to compare that language to people who are built differently, you may start discovering that what you called too much was often just truth without enough permission around it. That changes everything. Because once you stop treating your emotional depth like a character flaw, you can begin building a life that actually honors it instead of constantly fighting it. You can stop forcing yourself into environments that reward numbness and then blaming yourself for not thriving there. You can stop measuring your strength by how unaffected you appear. You can stop making your tenderness prove itself useful before you let it be valid. That kind of self-permission is not indulgent. It is intelligent. It is what allows a person to stop living in quiet opposition to their own nature. And maybe that is the truth your heart needs before sleep tonight, that there is nothing inherently shameful about being someone who feels deeply, nothing embarrassing about being moved, affected, touched, stirred, wounded, softened, changed by life, nothing broken about needing more time to process what others seem to shake off. Nothing weak about having a heart that does not know how to stay surface level all the time. You do not need to become less feeling in order to become more whole. You do not need to harden into someone else's idea of strength just because the world sometimes misunderstands your softness, and you do not need to apologize for the depth of your inner life just because it does not always fit neatly into environments built for emotional speed. Because the truth is, there is something profoundly beautiful about a person who still feels deeply in a world that keeps rewarding disconnection. And maybe your depth was never the burden you thought it was. Maybe it has simply been waiting to be met with the kind of understanding that turns shame back into self-respect. Because there is nothing wrong with being someone who feels deeply. Not tonight. Not ever. You are allowed to rest from being strong all the time. There is a kind of tiredness that sleep alone does not fix. It is not just physical fatigue, although that can be part of it. It is the exhaustion that comes from being the one who keeps holding everything together for too long, the one who adapts, the one who copes, the one who gets through it, the one who stays functional, stays thoughtful, stays composed, stays useful, stays available, stays calm enough to carry what life keeps placing on their shoulders. And after a while, that role can become so normal that you stop noticing how much it has cost you. You just keep doing what you do. Keep pushing, keep managing, keep surviving in a way that looks stable from the outside while something inside you quietly gets more and more tired of always being the reliable one. That kind of strength can become a prison when it stops being a choice and starts becoming an identity you feel trapped inside. Because then even your pain has to stay organized. Even your exhaustion has to remain graceful. Even your breakdowns have to happen in ways that do not inconvenience anyone too much. You can be drowning and still feel pressure to look emotionally articulate while it happens. And that is one of the loneliest positions a person can end up in. Not just because you are carrying a lot, but because the version of you people have learned to rely on can start making it very hard for anyone to imagine that you need care too. Sometimes even you forget. You get so used to being the steady one that vulnerability starts feeling almost unnatural, foreign, embarrassing, unsafe. Like if you really let yourself drop the performance of being okay, something important might collapse. Maybe people would worry. Maybe they would not know what to do. Maybe they would see you differently. Maybe you would see yourself differently. So instead, you keep being strong in all the ways that no longer feel sustainable because at least that role is familiar. But familiar does not always mean healthy, and being capable does not mean being endlessly okay. That is such an important distinction, especially for people who have spent years surviving by becoming the emotionally competent one. The one who can keep going through hard things without making too much noise, the one who figures it out, the one who does not need much, the one who recovers quickly enough to stay useful. Those traits can look admirable, and sometimes they genuinely are, but they can also become coping mechanisms that slowly disconnect you from your own limits. That is where so much hidden burnout begins. Not in dramatic collapse at first, but in the quieter habit of never fully letting yourself soften, never fully letting yourself need, never fully letting yourself be held in the same way you have learned to hold everyone else. And over time, that creates a very painful imbalance. You become good at enduring, but not always good at receiving. Good at carrying, but not always good at resting. Good at surviving, but not always good at letting yourself be human without immediately trying to package that humanity into something manageable. That is a heavy way to live, because no one can stay emotionally armored forever without eventually feeling the cost in their body, their mind, their relationships, their joy, their sense of self. Constant strength has a way of drying people out from the inside if it is never interrupted by softness. And maybe that is what needs to be said more often. Strength is not supposed to be your permanent resting state. It is something you access when needed. It is not something you are supposed to live inside every second of your life until your nervous system forgets what ease even feels like. But a lot of people were never really taught that. They were taught that being strong means being less affected, less needy, less emotional, less breakable, less dependent, less visibly human. And because of that, they start treating their own tenderness like a threat to the identity they have worked so hard to maintain. But tenderness is not the opposite of strength. Suppression is not the same thing as resilience, and rest is not weakness. In fact, the inability to rest often says more about what a person has had to survive than it does about how strong they are. That matters if you have been feeling guilty lately for being more tired than usual, more withdrawn, more emotional, less available, less patient, less capable of carrying what you normally carry without strain, because maybe that does not mean you are failing. Maybe it means the part of you that has been overfunctioning for too long is finally asking for relief, and relief is not something you have to earn by completely falling apart first. You are allowed to want rest before collapse. You are allowed to be honest before breaking. You are allowed to stop performing strength every minute just because the people around you are used to that version of you. That is not selfish. That is self-preservation. And maybe tonight, if you have been quietly carrying too much for too long, if you have been trying to keep it all together in ways that nobody fully sees, this is the truth your nervous system needs most. You do not have to be the strong one every second in order to still be worthy, respectable, dependable, or loved. You do not have to keep proving your resilience by depriving yourself of softness. You do not have to keep earning your place in the world through endless emotional endurance. You are allowed to loosen your grip. You are allowed to stop bracing for a while. You are allowed to let the version of you that is always holding everything up sit down for the night. Because even the strongest parts of you need somewhere to rest. And maybe that is what tonight can be, not a performance, not another test of how much you can carry without asking for anything, just a small honest permission to put some of it down, because you are allowed to rest from being strong all the time. Even your unfinished life can still be meaningful and beautiful. There is a kind of grief that does not always look like grief at first. It can look like restlessness, like self-criticism, like this low, steady disappointment that follows you around when you compare your actual life to the one you thought you would have by now, the version where things would feel more settled, more clear, more complete, more impressive, more emotionally resolved, more on track. And even if you do not say it out loud, there can be this quiet assumption underneath so much of that ache, that the parts of your life that are still unfinished are the parts that are still not good enough yet, still not meaningful enough yet, still not beautiful enough yet, still waiting to become something worthy of peace. That belief is so common and so brutal, because it teaches people to postpone their own relationship with meaning until everything finally looks complete, until the healing is done, until the right relationship arrives, until the career makes sense, until the body feels better, until the money is more stable, until the identity is more solid, until the future is more certain, until the grief softens, until the life finally starts resembling the version they thought would feel easier to love. And while they wait for that version, they keep treating the life they actually have like an unfinished draft that does not deserve full tenderness yet. That is where so much unnecessary suffering comes from. Not only from what is missing, but from the belief that what is missing has disqualified everything else from being meaningful in the meantime. But that is not how life works. And honestly, if meaning only arrived after completion, almost nobody would get to touch it for very long. Because human life is unfinished by nature. Always, there is almost always something in motion, something unresolved, something becoming, something uncertain, something still healing, still forming, still breaking open, still asking for time. Even in the most beautiful seasons, there are usually parts of life that remain incomplete. Some hope still waiting, some question still unanswered, some ache still unhealed, some part of the story still not where you want it to be. That does not make the whole life less real, and it does not make it less beautiful, but the mind often struggles to see beauty in what has not yet reached its ideal form. It loves neatness, closure, resolution. It wants the before and after, the satisfying arc, the version of your life that can be easily explained and emotionally tied up. So when your actual life stays messy longer than expected, when the growth is slow, when the healing is non-linear, when the future is unclear, when the pieces are still scattered, it can become easy to assume that this chapter is somehow lesser. Like it only exists to be endured until the better, more complete version finally begins. But what if this is not the waiting room? What if this is also life? Not the polished version, not the final version, but still your real living, meaningful life. That question matters more than people realize. Because the moment you stop treating unfinishedness like disqualification, your whole relationship to the present begins to soften. You stop needing your life to look complete before you let it matter. You stop needing every part of your story to make sense before you allow yourself to feel touched by what is already here. You stop missing the quiet beauty of things simply because they have not reached their most resolved form yet. And there is so much quiet beauty in unfinished things. In trying again, in becoming, in rebuilding, in healing that is still in progress, in a life that is still rearranging itself into something more honest, in the person you are while you are still learning, in the tenderness of not having all the answers and still continuing anyway. That kind of beauty is not always glamorous. It does not always photograph well. It does not always impress people who only know how to admire outcomes. But it is real, and often, it is the kind of beauty that shapes a soul much more deeply than the tidy milestones ever could, because there is something profoundly human about a life that is still becoming itself. A life with loose ends, a life with uncertainty, a life with unanswered questions and evolving dreams and half-healed places and ordinary moments that are still carrying meaning even before the story fully comes together. That deserves more reverence than shame, especially if you have been quietly mourning the fact that your life still does not look how you hoped it would by now, especially if you have been struggling to feel proud of a chapter that still feels emotionally under construction. Especially if you have been assuming that beauty only belongs to people whose lives look more complete from the outside. Because the truth is, some of the most beautiful lives are not the most finished ones, they are the most honest ones. The ones where a person is still showing up inside a story that has not fully resolved. The ones where tenderness still exists in the middle of uncertainty. The ones where meaning is being made in small moments, not just in major outcomes. The ones where a person learns how to stop withholding love from the life they have just because it is not yet the life they imagined. That is a deep kind of healing. And maybe tonight, that is the truth worth falling asleep to. You do not need your life to be fully figured out before it gets to matter. You do not need every piece in place before there is beauty here. You do not need your story to look complete before it becomes worthy of tenderness. There is meaning in your trying. There is beauty in your becoming, there is dignity in your unfinishedness, and there is something deeply sacred about a life that is still in progress and still, somehow, still capable of holding joy, softness, truth, love, grief, hope, and beauty all at once. So if your life feels incomplete tonight, maybe let that be true without making it mean empty. Because unfinished does not mean broken. Unfinished does not mean wasted. Unfinished does not mean less worthy of being loved while you are living it. Even now, with loose ends and unanswered questions and chapters still unfolding, your life can still be meaningful, and it can still be beautiful. You have already made it through nights you thought would break you. There are certain nights that do not leave your life quietly. Nights that stretch longer than they should. Nights where time feels strange and your chest feels heavy, and your thoughts keep circling the same fear, the same loss, the same ache, the same question you cannot answer. Nights where the room is silent but your inner world is anything but. Nights where everything that hurts seems louder because there is nothing around to distract you from it. No errands, no notifications, no conversations to hide inside, no daylight to make things feel manageable. Just you and the rawness of whatever life has brought to the surface. Those nights can make a person feel incredibly fragile, not in some dramatic, poetic way, but in the very real, physical, human way where your body feels like it is carrying too much and your mind starts whispering that maybe this is the one thing you will not know how to survive. Maybe this pain is too big. Maybe this grief is too deep. Maybe this fear is too consuming. Maybe this loneliness is too sharp. Maybe this uncertainty is finally too much. And when you are inside one of those nights, it can be hard to remember that you have ever felt anything else. Hard to remember that you have ever been on the other side of darkness before. That is what pain does. It narrows your vision. It makes the current ache feel like the whole truth. It convinces you that because this moment feels unbearable, it must actually be unendurable. But those are not the same thing. And maybe that is what your heart needs to hear tonight. If something in you feels close to the edge of itself, you have felt this kind of intensity before in one form or another. Not the exact same story, maybe, not the exact same circumstances, but that same terrifying feeling of I do not know how I am supposed to carry this. That same night where your nervous system felt flooded. That same hour where your thoughts got dark and your chest got tight, and your hope got very quiet. That same moment where part of you genuinely believed you might not come back from whatever this was doing to you, and yet, somehow, you did. Not always gracefully, not always quickly, not always in a way that made sense while it was happening, but you are here. That matters more than your mind tends to let you feel, because survival often looks much less dramatic from the inside than it does in hindsight. It usually does not feel like strength while it is happening. It feels like confusion, numbness, tears, pacing, shallow breathing, staying up too late, falling asleep from exhaustion more than peace, waking up and doing another day while your insides still feel rearranged. It feels messy and ordinary and underwhelming, and because it does not always look heroic, people forget that it was still survival. They forget what it actually took to make it through those nights when their world felt smallest and darkest. But your body remembers. Your soul remembers. Some part of you has already lived through hours that once seemed impossible. And that does not mean your pain tonight is not real. It does not mean you should just be over it. It does not mean the fact that you survived before automatically makes this easy now. That is not the point. The point is that your fear is not the only evidence in the room. There is also history here. There is also proof. There is also the quiet fact that you have already endured more emotional darkness than your current panic is giving you credit for. That changes something, because when pain convinces you that you are too fragile for this moment, memory can gently remind you that fragility and endurance are not opposites. Human beings can feel like they are falling apart and still keep living. They can cry and still survive. They can shake and still make it to morning. They can feel deeply unsteady and still remain here. That is one of the least glamorous but most profound truths about being alive. And maybe you need that truth because a lot of people secretly think they are only strong if they suffer elegantly, if they remain composed, if they stay optimistic, if they keep their pain articulate and inspiring. But real endurance is often much less pretty than that. Sometimes it is just not leaving yourself. Sometimes it is simply making it to the next hour. Sometimes it is breathing through a wave instead of needing to understand it immediately. Sometimes it is staying alive inside a night your mind keeps insisting is too much. That counts. That has always counted. And maybe one of the kindest things you can remember right now is that the version of you who survived your hardest nights did not always know how they were doing it either. They did not always feel brave. They did not always feel hopeful. They did not always have clarity, peace, or inspiring perspective. A lot of the time they just stayed. They let the night pass through them one unbearable piece at a time until eventually it was morning again. That is not small. That is sacred, because there are versions of you in your past who were sure they were about to be destroyed by what they were feeling. And still, they carried you here. That means something. It means there is more strength in you than fear tends to acknowledge when the room gets quiet. It means there is a part of you that already knows how to outlast a hard night, even when the conscious part of you feels unconvinced. It means your pain may be loud, but it is not the whole story. So if tonight feels heavy, if your thoughts feel darker than usual, if something in you feels frightened by the intensity of what you are carrying, maybe let this truth stay close. You do not need to feel invincible in order to make it through the night. You do not need to feel okay in order to keep going. You do not need to have answers before morning. You only need to remember that this is not the first night your pain has tried to convince you it would break you, and it is not the first time you have quietly stayed anyway. That matters. That history matters. That version of you matters. Because you have already made it through nights you thought would destroy you, and maybe, very quietly, that means there is more life in you tonight than fear is able to see. Tonight, it is enough to simply exist and breathe. There are nights when even the smallest things can start to feel strangely heavy, not because anything dramatic is necessarily happening in that exact moment, but because your system has just reached its limit for holding, processing, performing, deciding, coping, carrying, and staying composed. And when that happens, the mind often does something deeply unfair. Instead of responding with softness, it starts adding pressure. It starts whispering that you should still be doing something useful with this time. Solving something. Fixing something. Planning something. Processing something better. Being more productive with your pain. Being more disciplined with your healing. Being more intentional with your rest, as if even your exhaustion has to prove itself worthy before you are allowed to simply stop for a while. That is such a painful way to end a day. Because sometimes what a person actually needs is not another insight, another breakthrough, another strategy, another piece of advice, another reason to keep pushing through. Sometimes what they need most is permission to stop making their existence into a task, permission to not optimize this moment, permission to not improve this moment, permission to not emotionally perform for this moment, permission to not turn tonight into another opportunity to become better, wiser, calmer, stronger, more healed, more figured out, or more useful. Just permission to be here. That sounds so simple, but for a lot of people it is incredibly hard, because if you have spent long enough living in survival mode, your nervous system can start feeling suspicious of stillness. It can start interpreting non-productivity as irresponsibility. It can start believing that if you are not actively doing something, then you are falling behind, wasting time, losing control, or failing to use your life correctly. So even when your body is tired, even when your emotions are full, even when your mind is clearly overworked, some part of you still keeps trying to stay mentally on duty. That is exhausting in a way people do not always know how to name. It is not just tiredness. It is the inability to stop earning your right to exist. And that is such a deep wound. Because no human being was meant to live every hour as if their worth depends on output, improvement, resilience, insight, composure, or visible progress. But so many people do. They move through life with this constant low-grade pressure to justify their presence through doing, through proving, through carrying, through functioning, through becoming. And after a while, they stop knowing how to just be a person without also trying to be a project. That is why nights can feel so emotionally exposing, because when the doing slows down, the pressure underneath it becomes easier to hear. The pressure to matter, the pressure to be enough, the pressure to have used the day well enough, the pressure to have handled life well enough, the pressure to not fall too far behind your own expectations. And if that pressure has been especially loud in you lately, then maybe this is the truth that needs to meet it tonight. You are not required to accomplish your way into deserving rest. You are not required to heal impressively in order to be held by this moment. You are not required to use tonight well. You are not required to turn your breath into a performance. You are allowed to stop. Not forever. Not because nothing matters, but because your humanity matters too. And sometimes the most honest thing a person can do is let the day end without asking one more thing of themselves. That is not laziness. That is not giving up. That is not weakness. That is a form of mercy. And maybe mercy is exactly what your system has been starved for. Not more pressure disguised as motivation. Not more self-surveillance disguised as discipline. Not more inner management disguised as self-awareness. Just mercy. The kind that says, I do not need to become anything else in the next few hours in order to be allowed here. The kind that says, I can let tonight be small. The kind that says, I can release the idea that every waking moment has to justify itself. That changes the whole atmosphere inside a person. Because once you stop making existence into a performance, something softer can finally happen. The jaw unclenches a little. The chest loosens a little. The mind stops sprinting for a second. The body feels less like a machine that keeps disappointing you and more like a living thing that has simply carried enough for one day. That shift may seem tiny, but it is not. It is the difference between living like a burden to yourself and living like someone whose life is allowed to have unproductive, unresolved, ordinary, breathing moments that still count. And they do count. In fact, some of the most sacred moments in a human life are the least impressive ones. The quiet moments. The unremarkable ones. The ones where nothing is being achieved except the fact that a person is still here, still breathing, still making it through another night in a body, in a mind, in a life that has asked a lot from them. That is not meaningless. That is life itself. So if your mind has been trying to tell you that tonight should be used better, handled better, lived better, maybe let this truth interrupt it. You do not need to make anything beautiful happen right now. You do not need to solve anything before sleep. You do not need to become more understandable, more healed, more productive, more composed, or more complete in the next hour. You do not need to do anything extraordinary with tonight. You are allowed to let this moment be simple. You are allowed to let your body be tired. You are allowed to let your mind be unfinished. You are allowed to stop carrying yourself so hard for a little while. Because tonight, it is enough that you are here. Enough that your chest still rises. Enough that your body is still trying. Enough that life is still moving through you, even quietly. Enough that you made it this far into the dark. Tonight, it is enough to simply exist and breathe.